I found out my husband was broken, and cheating on me with a 26-year-old marketing coordinator named Courtney Blaze, all in the span of one train ride, because I grabbed the wrong phone off the kitchen counter at 7:14 in the morning. My name is Elena Voss Marsh. I'm 34 years old. I make $220,000 a year finding other people's stolen money for a living. And it took me exactly 11 minutes and 40 seconds on the Metro North 722 Express to Grand Central to realize my own husband had been stealing from me the entire time. If you're watching this from a train right now, on your own commute, pretending to look out the window while your whole life quietly rearranges itself in your lap, comment the city you're riding through and hit subscribe, because by the end of this story, you're going to want to know exactly how a woman who spends her days untangling other people's lies missed the one unraveling in her own house. 3 things happened before I even got off that train, and I need you to hold on to all 3, because none of them made sense on their own and all of them mattered. The first was the phone call. I hadn't even opened Bradley's messages yet. I'd grabbed his phone by pure accident. Mine was face down under a stack of client folders on the counter. His was the one charging by the coffee maker, and in the scramble to make the 722, I just swept it into my bag along with my badge and my travel mug. It buzzed before we'd even cleared the tunnel under the East River. Vanessa, the screen said, my sister-in-law, and because I am, apparently, congenitally incapable of letting a phone ring twice, I answered it thinking Brad had left it behind for a reason, and she needed him urgently. Finally, Vanessa said, not even a hello, not even checking who she was talking to. Did you move the $22,000 out of the joint account before Elena's accountant friend does the quarterly reconciliation? Or are we actually going to let her find it this time? There was a pause on the line, the specific, ringing pause of someone realizing they've said something into the wrong ear. Brad, she said, and I said, very calmly, in the voice I use when I'm on the phone with the IRS, no, Vanessa, it's Elena. The second thing was the document. While Vanessa was still stammering out an excuse about a birthday fund for their mother, Diane, I did what I do for a living. I opened the banking app on Bradley's phone, because a locked phone doesn't mean much to a forensic accountant whose husband has used the same 4-digit PIN, his childhood dog's name spelled in numbers, for 11 years. There it was, sitting in a joint household account I hadn't looked at in months because Bradley had asked to handle the boring stuff. After his consulting business slowed down, a transfer out, 3 days earlier, for $22,400, routed to an account named Marsh Family Holdings LLC. I had never heard of Marsh Family Holdings LLC. I have built my entire career on knowing precisely when an entity like that exists, to do exactly one thing, which is disappear money in plain sight. The third thing was smaller, and it's the one that actually made my hands go cold on the subway pole. Under recent photos, the very last image on Bradley's camera roll, taken at 11:47 the night before, while he told me he was closing out inventory numbers at the office, was a picture of a hotel keycard sleeve from the Aria Grand on Lexington, room 1408, sitting on a nightstand next to a woman's bracelet I didn't recognize, and a room service receipt for 2 glasses of the same overpriced Sancerre we'd had at our wedding. $22,000 I couldn't account for, a shell company with our name on it that I'd never signed, a hotel room, a stranger's bracelet, and a wine we'd promised, half drunk and stupidly young 9 years earlier, that we'd only ever drink together again on anniversaries. 3 loops, opened in the space of one subway car rattling under Roosevelt Island. And I want to tell you right now, before I explain a single other detail of how I built the case that ended my marriage and ended 2 other people's freedom in a ballroom full of 400 witnesses 11 months later, I did not cry on that train. I have cried exactly 4 times in the last decade, and none of them were about Bradley Marsh. What I did on that train was open a blank spreadsheet on my work laptop, title it MFH01, and start writing down everything I knew in the order I knew it with timestamps. That spreadsheet grew into 41 tabs by the time I was done. This is the story of how it grew, who it took down with it, and what it cost me to become, for the first time in my adult life, exactly as ruthless as everyone in my husband's family had always secretly assumed I already was. Let me back up, because you need to understand exactly what I married and exactly what I built before I married it, or none of what happens next will land the way it should. I grew up in Albany, in a small brick house with a mother who did payroll for a school district, and a father, Richard Voss, who spent 31 years as a financial crimes examiner for the New York State Attorney General's office, before he retired to a lake house he still complains is too quiet. Dinner conversation in my house was fraud typologies. I learned what a shell company was before I learned long division. By the time I was 26, I had a CPA license, a CFE certification, and a job at a mid-sized forensic accounting firm in Manhattan called Hollis Denby Group, tracing embezzlement for insurance companies and asset misappropriation for private equity funds who'd been burned by a portfolio company's CFO. I was good at it. I am still good at it. My colleagues call me the machine behind my back, which I know because one of them, a junior analyst named Priya, told me to my face, laughing, assuming I'd take it as a compliment. I did. I met Bradley Marsh at a charity gala for a children's hospital in October, 9.5 years ago, when I was 24 and still knew enough to money to be dazzled by the appearance of it. He was 30 then, tall, with the kind of easy, room-filling charm that makes people assume competence they haven't actually verified, wearing a tuxedo that I now know, in hindsight and forensic detail, was rented that night and every gala night for the next 4 years until his mother finally bought him one for his 30th birthday. He told me his family owned Marsh & Sons Construction and Development, a firm his grandfather had founded in Westchester in 1958, and that he was in operations, mostly on the growth side. What that actually meant, I would learn over the following decade in agonizing increments, was that Bradley held the title of Vice President of Business Development at his family's company, drew a salary of $91,000 a year, attended a great many lunches, and had never, not once in the company's 66-year history, brought in a piece of new business that didn't originate from a lead his mother Diane Marsh had already cultivated for him. The Marsh family performed wealth the way other families perform faith, constantly, visibly, and with an unshakable conviction that the performance itself was the substance. Diane Marsh, 61 years old, silver bob cut every 6 weeks at a salon on Greenwich Avenue, wore a rotation of 4 Chanel jackets to every event she attended and referred to the company, which her late husband Walter had actually built with his own hands and a single dump truck in 1958, as our little family legacy, as though she personally had ever poured a foundation. Diane's fixed trait, the one you will watch her display in scene after scene without variation, was arrogance. Not loud, aggressive arrogance, but the quiet, bone-deep arrogance of a woman who has never once in 61 years questioned whether she was owed the room she was standing in. She corrected waiters' pronunciation of wine regions. She introduced me at every single family function for 9 years as Bradley's wife. She does something with numbers, despite having watched me testify as an expert witness in federal court on television, on the local news, twice. Bradley's younger sister, Vanessa Marsh Cole, 31 when this story starts, married to a man named Chad Cole who worked, nominally, in commercial real estate, but had not, to my direct knowledge, closed a transaction in the 4 years I'd known him, was entitlement given a spray tan and a Peloton subscription. Vanessa's fixed trait was pure, uncut entitlement. The conviction, expressed in 10,000 small transactions over a decade, that whatever she wanted was already rightfully hers, and the only outstanding question was logistics. She had asked to borrow money from Bradley and me 4 times in 9 years, always framed as an investment in something: a boutique fitness studio that closed in 11 months, a skincare line that never shipped a single product, a wellness retreat property in the Catskills that turned out to be a down payment on Vanessa and Chad's own house, which she never disclosed to us, which I only discovered because I happened to be able to read a county property record for fun on a Sunday morning. She called me, to my face, at Thanksgiving 4 years ago, the practical one, in the same tone she'd use for the help. I want to give you one more layer of texture on the family dynamic before I go further into each of them individually, because it explains something crucial about why none of this behavior ever produced consequences inside the family system for 9 straight years. Every single confrontation that ever threatened to happen between me and any member of the Marsh family was, without exception, diffused by Bradley himself, playing a role I came to recognize, once I finally understood the pattern, as the family's designated pressure valve. When I once, in year 4, gently raised with Bradley the question of whether Vanessa's second unrepaid loan should come with any actual terms attached, Bradley didn't defend Vanessa directly. He simply looked wounded, said something like, "Can we not do this right now? I've had a long week," and let the conversation dissolve into an apology from me for bringing it up at an inconvenient time, a pattern so consistent across 9 years that I can, even now, recall at least a dozen separate instances of it with almost identical dialogue. I've since learned from a therapist I started seeing after everything fell apart, an extremely common structure in families that quietly extract resources from a single high-earning member. The extraction itself is rarely defended outright, because defending it would require acknowledging it exists, and acknowledging it would collapse the family's preferred narrative about itself. Instead, the family produces an emotional cost, calibrated precisely to the size of the boundary being tested, sufficient to make raising the question again feel not worth the resulting friction. Bradley was, in this sense, extraordinarily well cast in his role, not because he was manipulative in any calculated villainous way, but because he had grown up inside this exact system his entire life and had simply never developed any other operating mode for handling financial accountability within his own family. I want to tell you about the weekend, 3 years before any of this started, when I designed that internal controls framework for Marsh & Sons. Because it's the piece of this story that makes the eventual fraud feel less like bad luck and more like a door I had, unknowingly, helped install the exact size of the eventual break-in through. Diane had asked me, at a Sunday dinner, in the breezy, flattering way she occasionally deployed when she wanted something from me without appearing to need it, whether I'd be willing to just take a quick look at the company's expense approval process, because their outside bookkeeper had mentioned, vaguely, that things could probably be tightened up a bit. I spent that entire weekend, unpaid, building a proper segregation of duties framework. Dual approval requirements above $5,000, mandatory documentation for any expense described as client entertainment or business development, quarterly reconciliation reviews by someone outside the immediate family. I presented it to Diane and Bradley together, at their kitchen table, walking them through exactly why each threshold mattered, using real examples from cases I'd worked at Hollis Denby, of exactly how family businesses get quietly bled by exactly the kind of loose, trust-based systems Marsh & Sons was currently running on. Diane listened for about 11 minutes, then waved her hand, the same gesture she'd use, years later, dismissing my comment about interest rates, and said, "Elena, this is all very thorough, but honestly, dear, we're not some Fortune 500 company. We're a family. Walter always said the day you need paperwork to trust your own children is the day you've stopped actually being a family." I remember Bradley nodding along with his mother, visibly relieved not to have to implement anything that might have made his own life more complicated, and the framework I'd built went into a drawer in Diane's home office and was never implemented in any form beyond the single $10,000 secondary review threshold that Bradley, ironically, 3 years later, would study carefully enough to structure 8 separate fraudulent transactions, specifically to stay just underneath. I think about that weekend often, now, because it taught me something I didn't fully understand until much later. Diane's rejection of that framework wasn't really about family sentiment at all, whatever language she used to describe it. It was about control. A proper internal control system would have required Diane herself to submit to review, to have her own expenses and decisions checked by someone outside the family, and Diane Marsh had spent her entire adult life ensuring that no one, ever, checked her math. Not her husband while he was alive, not her accountant, not her son, and certainly not a daughter-in-law she'd spent a decade quietly positioning as competent but subordinate, useful but never, under any circumstances, in a position of actual oversight. The framework sitting unused in that drawer for 3 years wasn't an oversight. It was, I came to believe, an active choice, made by a woman who understood, on some level she probably never fully articulated even to herself, that real accountability was the one thing her family's entire self-image could not survive. Chad Cole's fixed trait was laziness, and I want to be precise about that, because it wasn't stupidity, and it wasn't even unlikability. Chad was perfectly pleasant at a barbecue. Chad's laziness was structural. He had graduated from a decent state school with a business degree, had held 4 jobs in 9 years, none longer than 14 months, and had, on at least 3 occasions that I personally witnessed, allowed Vanessa to lie for him about his employment status to Diane, who funded a family bridge loan twice to cover a mortgage payment Chad had simply not made because he forgot, his word, to transfer the money from a brokerage account he'd been too disengaged to actually monitor. Chad's contribution to every family gathering was showing up 40 minutes late and leaving before the dishes were cleared. He once asked me, unprompted, whether I could just glance at his and Vanessa's taxes for free, since you're already doing this stuff anyway, gesturing vaguely at my entire profession as though it were a hobby I did for fun on weekends, like knitting. And then there was Courtney Blaze, though I did not have a name for her yet on that train. I only had a bracelet and a room number. Courtney, I would learn over the following weeks, was 26 years old, had been hired 18 months earlier as a marketing coordinator at Marsh & Sons, reporting, on paper, to the director of communications, but in practice spending the overwhelming majority of her working hours coordinating with Bradley, directly on growth initiatives that never generated a single new signed contract. Courtney's fixed trait was opportunism, the purest kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself with malice, but simply, patiently, positions itself wherever resources are flowing and waits. She was not, I want to be fair to her for one paragraph before I stop being fair to her entirely, a mustache-twirling villain. She was a smart, underpaid 26-year-old who had figured out, correctly, that the fastest path to financial security in that office ran directly through the emotionally starved, financially cornered 40-year-old vice president of business development, whose wife made twice his salary and never asked him a single hard question about where his time went. Because I trusted him, because I loved him, because for 9 years I had structured my entire understanding of my marriage around the belief that competence and honesty were things Bradley possessed simply because he was my husband and I had chosen him. Here's the part that still, honestly, makes something in my chest tighten even now. Telling it to you, I was the breadwinner from the very first year, and I never once made Bradley feel it, because I have spent my whole career learning what shame does to people who are cornered by their own inadequacy, and I did not want to corner my husband. I paid off his graduate school loans in year 2, quietly, from a bonus, and told him it was a joint decision from our savings, when it was entirely my money and entirely my decision. I let him believe that the 4-bedroom colonial in Bronxville, the one with the wraparound porch and the 2-car garage and the Sub-Zero refrigerator, was a we purchase, when the down payment came from a Hollis Denby partnership bonus I earned uncovering an $11 million Ponzi scheme run by a wealth manager in Greenwich. I built, over 9 years, a marriage-shaped structure that functioned entirely on my income and my forbearance, and the entire Marsh family, every last one of them, from Diane down to Chad, understood this arrangement perfectly and never once thanked me for it, because thanking me would have required acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would have collapsed the entire performance of the Marsh legacy that all 4 of them depended on, financially and psychologically, to get out of bed every morning feeling like the people they'd convinced themselves they were. I want you to sit with one more detail before I move forward in the story, because it matters for everything that comes later. Marsh & Sons Construction and Development had, at the time this story begins, 41 full-time employees, 3 active commercial developments in Westchester and Fairfield counties, and, this is the number I would spend the next several months confirming down to the penny, a revolving line of credit with a regional bank that Diane had personally guaranteed with her late husband's life insurance payout, an asset she believed, right up until the very last scene of this story, that no one outside the family's own attorney had ever seen the actual documentation of. Diane was wrong about that, and so, it would turn out, was Bradley, about a great many things, starting with his fundamental, catastrophic misunderstanding of what his wife actually did for a living, and precisely how good at it she was. I think, before I go further into the slow accretion of financial dysfunction, it's worth telling you about the proposal itself, because it contained, in miniature, almost everything that would eventually define our marriage. Bradley proposed at the Millbrook Barn venue itself, 18 months before we'd actually marry there, on a private tour he'd arranged, he told me, because I wanted you to see the place before anyone else did, before it's just another wedding venue to you. It felt, at the time, extraordinarily romantic, thoughtful, specific, tailored to a version of me he seemed to understand deeply. I would learn years later, doing the same forensic work on my own memories that I'd once only applied to strangers' finances, that Diane had actually arranged that private tour months in advance as a favor from a family friend who sat on the venue's board, and that Bradley had, in the retelling to me that evening and for years afterward, simply absorbed his mother's logistical work as his own spontaneous romantic gesture, a pattern of quiet credit-taking that I now recognize as the exact same instinct that let him tell dinner party guests he'd designed a bar renovation I'd paid for and planned entirely myself. I said yes that evening in the empty barn, golden hour light coming through the old wooden slats, feeling, genuinely, like the luckiest woman in the world, and I want to be honest that some real, uncomplicated part of that happiness was true and worth having. Even now, even knowing everything I know, it just wasn't built on the foundation I believed it was built on at the time. I want to tell you about the first year of our marriage in a little more detail, because the patterns that eventually broke us were visible from almost the very beginning, if I'd been willing to look at them with the same rigor I applied to strangers' finances every single day at Hollis Denby. 6 months into the marriage, Bradley suggested we consolidate our finances into joint accounts, the way real partners do, a suggestion I now recognize, with the clarity of hindsight, as the single most consequential financial decision of our entire relationship. because it meant that from month 7 of our marriage onward, there was no meaningful separation between what I earned and what the household spent, and no natural friction point at which Bradley's spending patterns would have to be independently justified to anyone but me, a wife who had already decided, somewhere in the earliest months of the marriage, that scrutinizing her husband's finances the way she scrutinized a client's books would feel, to her own ear, disloyal. I want to be honest about how good the early years actually felt, because I think it's important, in telling a story like this one, not to pretend the whole 9 years were a slow-motion warning sign I simply refused to see. There were real years of real happiness in that marriage, dinners that felt like partnership, trips to Portugal and Vermont that felt like genuine shared joy, a version of Bradley in year 2 and year 3 who called me, unprompted, in the middle of a workday just to tell me he'd seen something that reminded him of me. The person who eventually built a shell company in Delaware did not spring, fully formed, from nowhere in year 8. He accreted, slowly, out of small compromises and small entitlements that neither of us ever named directly. The same way Priya's timeline would eventually reveal that $81,000 didn't arrive at Vanessa's account in one transaction, but in 3, spaced out, each individually small enough to seem unremarkable. The first real financial red flag, in hindsight, came in year 3, when Bradley's promised promotion to senior vice president, a title Diane had apparently discussed with him casually at a family dinner, the kind of promise that in the Marsh family functioned less as an actual corporate decision and more as a mood Diane occasionally expressed, never materialized, and Bradley's response was not to ask harder questions about his own career trajectory within a family business that had no real board oversight or formal promotion structure, but to begin, quietly, describing himself to new acquaintances at parties as Senior Vice President of Business Development. Anyway, a title he used on a personal website he built for himself that year. A title he used, I would later confirm through an old cached version of a business networking profile, for the following 6 years, despite never once actually holding it. I found this, going back through old documents during the investigation, and I remember sitting with it for a long time, because it told me something important about the shape of the fraud that came later. Bradley had been performing a fictional version of his own professional identity for 6 years before he ever moved a single dollar improperly, and the shell company, when it finally came, was simply the financial expression of a lie he'd already been telling, unpunished, in every other dimension of his life, for the better part of a decade. Our wedding, for what it's worth, cost $208,000, held at a restored barn venue in Millbrook that Diane insisted on because it had old money bones, and I paid for $191,000 of it myself, because Walter had passed 18 months earlier and Diane told me, with her hand pressed to her sternum in the particular gesture she used whenever she wanted a financial conversation to end immediately, that things were tighter than people realized right now, with the transition. I believed her. I believed things were tighter than people realized. I did not yet understand that tighter than people realized was not a temporary condition of grief, but the permanent, structural condition of the entire Marsh family enterprise, propped up by a combination of my income, Diane's dwindling insurance principal, and a construction line of credit that was being drawn down faster than any of the 3 active projects could justify. The one person in my orbit who saw all of this clearly, from the very beginning, was Margot Reyes-Klein. Margot was 58 when this story starts, a matrimonial and asset forensics attorney who had built a 28-year career representing the financially sophisticated spouse in divorces that made the back pages of the New York Post, a woman the Times once described, in an article about a hedge fund founder's divorce, as someone who does not so much litigate as excavate. I'd met her 4 years into my career at a forensic accounting conference in Chicago, where she'd been a keynote panelist on tracing offshore asset transfers, and she'd sought me out afterwards specifically because of a question I'd asked from the audience about layered shell structures in family-owned businesses. We stayed in touch. She became, over the years, something between a mentor and the aunt I never had, the person I called when I wanted an unsentimental read on a professional problem, and, though I did not fully appreciate it until that Tuesday morning on the train, the single most important ally I would have in the 11 months ahead. Margot did not do warmth. Margot did precision, delivered so cleanly it could feel, to people who'd never needed her services, almost cruel. What Margot had, that I needed and did not yet know I needed, was a Rolodex. 3 decades of relationships with forensic examiners at the New York Attorney General's office. 2 sitting federal judges she'd clerked alongside in her 20s, and a standing, informal channel to an assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District's white-collar fraud unit named Devin Okafor, who owed Margot a favor from a case 11 years earlier that I would only fully understand the shape of much later. I called Margot from the sidewalk outside Grand Central at 8:02 that morning, standing against the cold stone wall of the terminal with Bradley's phone still in my coat pocket like a live coal, my own phone pressed to my ear, and I said 4 sentences to her before she cut me off. "Elena," she said, "do not call Bradley. Do not text Bradley. Do not confront anyone in that family until you and I have had a real conversation, and do not, under any circumstances, let that phone leave your possession or reset its passcode. Come to my office at 6. I did exactly what she told me, which is, I think, the first professional discipline I applied to the wreckage of my own marriage, and it is the discipline that made everything that followed possible. I treated my own life, from that moment forward, as a case file. Not a betrayal, a case file. Evidence gets contaminated by emotion the same way a crime scene gets contaminated by careless feet, and I had spent a decade training myself never to contaminate a scene. I went to work that day. I want you to understand what that cost me, and also what it bought me. Hollis Denby Group occupies 4 floors of a building on 6th Avenue, and my office on the 31st floor has a window that looks directly at another glass tower. So what I actually stared at for most of that day was my own dim reflection layered over strangers moving through their own unrelated Tuesdays. I ran, that morning, the exact same due diligence protocol I run for clients who suspect a business partner is skimming. I pulled every account Bradley's name touched that I had legal access to as a joint account holder. I cross-referenced routing numbers against a public entity database. I mapped, in a document I would eventually title MFH Timeline, the full registration history of Marsh Family Holdings LLC, which had been formed 9 months earlier in Delaware, a state chosen, transparently, for its notoriously thin disclosure requirements, listing a registered agent service in Wilmington and a single member whose name, when I finally pulled the amended filing that afternoon using a paralegal contact Margot had put me in touch with by lunchtime, was Bradley T. Marsh. Not Marsh & Sons Construction and Development. Not Diane Bradley personally, as an individual, had formed a Delaware shell company 9 months earlier, 3 months before Vanessa's failed skincare venture had supposedly needed family bridge funding, 4 months before Courtney Blaze's compensation, according to a pay stub I would not see until much later, had inexplicably increased by $14,000 a year, with no corresponding change in job title. $22,400, moved 3 days before I found it, was not, it turned out, an isolated transaction. It was the 9th transfer into Marsh Family Holdings LLC in 9 months. I did not know the other 8 yet. I knew, sitting at my desk at 4:50 that afternoon with the overhead lights starting to feel too bright and my coffee gone cold for the 3rd time, that I had exactly 1 hour before I needed to be in Margot's office on Park Avenue, and that everything I said to her in that hour was going to determine whether the next several months of my life were spent as a grieving, humiliated wife, or as the single most dangerous person Bradley Marsh had ever met. Margot's office smelled like cedar and old paper, and she had 2 things waiting on her desk when I walked in at 6 exactly: a legal pad with my name already written at the top, and a business card for a forensic examiner named Priya Anand. Not my junior colleague Priya, a different Priya entirely, one who did private forensic work outside insurance and litigation support, specializing in exactly the kind of closely held family business fraud I now suspected I was looking at. "Before you say anything emotional," Margot said, sliding a glass of water across the desk to me, rather than the wine I actually wanted, "I need 3 numbers from you. What does Bradley earn on paper? What have you funded in this marriage that isn't on paper as yours? And what is the largest single asset the Marsh family has that you personally have never seen documentation for?" I answered all 3 without hesitation, because I had already, in the 4 hours since the train, built the spreadsheet that contained the answers. 91,000, on paper. Approximately $1.1 million over 9 years. Once I added the wedding, the down payment, the loan payoff, 4 loans to Vanessa that were never repaid, and a standing arrangement where I covered 70% of our joint household expenses, despite Bradley's insistence, every single year at tax time, that we split things basically evenly. And the third, Walter's life insurance payout, roughly $2.3 million, which Diane had used, according to family lore repeated at every holiday for 9 years, to secure the company's future, but which I had never once seen a bank statement, a trust document, or a UCC filing for. Margot wrote nothing down. She just nodded, slowly, the way a doctor nods at a symptom that confirms a diagnosis she'd already suspected. "Here's what's going to happen," she said. "You are going to keep going to work every single day like nothing is wrong. because Bradley Marsh needs to believe, for as long as possible, that his wife found nothing more alarming on that phone than a sister-in-law's rude comment. You are going to let me retain Priya Anand under attorney-client privilege, so that everything she finds is protected work product and cannot be subpoenaed or discovered by opposing counsel later. And you are going to write down every single day, every single thing you observe, dated and time-stamped, because 6 months from now, when this goes in front of a judge, or possibly, Elena, in front of a jury, the difference between a credible witness and a hysterical one is going to be the granularity of your notes. She looked at me over her reading glasses, and for the first time in the 4 years I'd known her, I saw something that might have been sympathy cross her face before she visibly, deliberately put it away. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm going to say that exactly once, and then we're going to work." I called in sick to Hollis Denby the next morning. The only lie I told anyone that entire 11 months that I regret, mildly, on principle, and spent the day with Priya Anand in a conference room Margot kept for exactly these purposes. A windowless room on the 14th floor with 2 monitors, a secure printer, and a whiteboard we filled, by the end of that first day, with a structure diagram that looked, Priya said, like a textbook case of related party diversion, except unusually sloppy for how long it ran. Sloppy, it turned out, because Bradley was not a sophisticated fraudster. Bradley was a desperate, entitled man who had learned just enough from watching me work for 9 years to think he understood how to hide money, and not nearly enough to actually do it. Here is what Priya Anand found. Over the following 6 weeks, working from documents I had lawful access to as a joint account holder and documents Margot obtained through carefully worded subpoenas once we'd filed a preliminary asset preservation motion in Westchester County. Marsh Family Holdings LLC had received, over the 9 months since its formation, 11 separate transfers totaling $163,000, all originating from 3 sources. The Marsh & Sons Construction Operating Account, which Bradley had check signing authority over as Vice President of Business Development, up to a threshold of $25,000 per transaction, our joint household account, and, most damningly, a business development client entertainment expense line that Bradley had personally approved for himself 8 times in 9 months, each expense just under the $10,000 threshold that would have triggered a secondary review under the company's own internal controls, a threshold Bradley knew precisely because I had, 3 years earlier, at Diane's request, designed that exact internal controls framework for Marsh & Sons as a courtesy, unpaid, over a single weekend, because I loved my husband's family's business and wanted to see it succeed. Where had the money gone once it landed in Marsh Family Holdings LLC? $41,000 across 6 separate charges over 8 months had gone to the Aria Grand Hotel on Lexington Avenue, room service, valet, and, 3 separate times, a spa package for 2. $22,000 had gone to a jeweler on Madison Avenue, in 2 purchases, for pieces I had never seen on my own body, because they were never intended for my body. A remaining $81,000, and this is the detail that made Priya sit back in her chair and actually say the word "wow" out loud unprofessionally, before catching herself, had been wired in 3 installments to Vanessa Marsh Cole's personal checking account, disguised in the LLC's own internal bookkeeping, which Bradley had apparently been keeping himself in a shared spreadsheet I would later obtain as sibling consulting fee, market research. Despite Vanessa having no marketing background, no consulting license, and no deliverable of any kind that Priya could locate in 8 weeks of searching. Before I tell you what it felt like watching that diagram take shape, I want to walk through one specific working session with Priya in detail, because I think the mechanics matter, and because most people who watch videos like this one have never actually seen what forensic accounting looks like as a physical, tedious, hour-by-hour process, rather than a dramatic reveal. It was a Wednesday in late April, our 3rd full week of work, and we spent 9 straight hours in that windowless conference room, reconciling bank statements against Marsh & Sons' internal expense reporting system, a piece of accounting software the company had licensed years earlier and never properly configured, which meant that every single client entertainment expense Bradley had approved for himself had to be manually cross-checked against calendar records, because the software itself generated no automatic audit trail linking an expense line to a specific business purpose. Priya built what she called a gap analysis, a simple spreadsheet with 3 columns: the dollar amount, the stated business purpose according to Bradley's own expense memo, and the actual, verifiable business activity, if any, that had occurred on that date according to calendar invitations, email correspondence, or CRM entries. Of the 8 relevant client entertainment expenses over 9 months, 6 had no corresponding calendar event of any kind. One correlated with an actual calendar invitation for a lunch with a real prospective client, a regional developer named the Kowalski Group, except the expense amount submitted, $4,100, bore no plausible relationship to what a lunch for 3 people could reasonably cost, suggesting Bradley had used a legitimate meeting as cover to inflate an entirely separate transfer. The 8th event had a calendar invitation for something called Team Offsite Planning, scheduled for 8 p.m. on a Thursday, at a restaurant 6 blocks from the Aria Grand Hotel, a detail that told us, without needing anything further, exactly what kind of planning had actually occurred that evening. I remember, at hour 7 of that session, putting my pen down and asking Priya directly, because I needed to hear it from someone who wasn't emotionally involved, whether what we were building was actually as solid as I believed it was, or whether 7 months of hypervigilance had made me see patterns that a defense attorney could later dismantle in an afternoon. Priya, who had by that point worked 11 years in forensic accounting and had testified as an expert witness in 4 federal trials, looked at me for a long moment and said, "Elena, I've built weaker cases that got convictions, and I've seen much stronger circumstantial patterns get picked apart because the documentation was sloppy. This isn't that. Every single dollar in this timeline has a bank record, a timestamp, and in most cases, a secondary corroborating source. If anything, my only professional concern is that this is almost too clean. Juries sometimes distrust evidence that tells too complete a story, because real life is supposed to be messier than this. But that's a trial strategy problem, not an evidentiary problem, and it's Margot's problem to manage, not yours." I have held on to that conversation as one of the steadying anchors of the entire ordeal, because it was the first moment, 7 weeks in, that someone with genuine outside expertise confirmed, in plain language, that the structure I'd started building on a subway car was not paranoia. It was simply accurate. I want to pause here and tell you what it felt like to watch Priya build that diagram, line by line, connection by connection, because I think people imagine forensic discovery as a single gut punch revelation, and it is not. It is a slow accretion of small, individually survivable facts that compound over hours and days into something that eventually becomes unsurvivable. The hotel receipts alone I could have absorbed. Betrayal is common. I am not naive about the world, whatever else I am. It was the $81,000 to Vanessa that broke something specific in me, because it meant this was not one man's midlife weakness for a younger woman's attention. It was a family system. Diane had to have known, or at minimum, willfully not known, in the specific, curated way people protect themselves from inconvenient certainty, because Diane reviewed the company's quarterly financials personally, insisted on it, in fact, as her one remaining act of keeping her hand in, according to family lore. Chad had to have known at least about the money landing in his own household's joint account, because I later confirmed, through a records request Margot's office filed, that Chad and Vanessa had used $44,000 of that $81,000 to pay down the second mortgage on the Catskills property Vanessa had never told me she'd bought with money borrowed years earlier and never repaid. Everyone in that family, every single one of them, had drawn some portion of their comfortable, performed, superior life directly out of my husband's diversion of company funds and my own household's income, and every single one of them had looked at me, for 9 years, as the practical one, as though practicality were a mild personality quirk and not the exact quality that was, at that moment, 14 floors above a Manhattan sidewalk, assembling the case that would end them. There was one more piece Priya needed before we could take anything to an outside authority, and it took the longest to get, because it required something Margot had been circling for weeks without saying it directly, proof that this wasn't just marital misconduct, actionable in a divorce, but criminal diversion of corporate funds, and, given the interstate wire transfers and the Delaware entity, plausibly federal wire fraud. That distinction mattered enormously, Margot explained to me over a working dinner in her office, because a divorce court could redistribute assets and award me a favorable settlement, but only a criminal referral, made credibly, with documentation clean enough for federal investigators to move on quickly, would guarantee the kind of public, formal reckoning that would actually dismantle the Marsh family's ability to keep performing a legacy they had, in fact, been quietly cannibalizing for years. "You get to decide how much of a reckoning you want," Margot told me. "I can get you a very good settlement quietly, in 6 months, and you walk away wealthy and anonymous. Or I can introduce you to someone at the U.S. Attorney's Office, and this becomes something much bigger, and much more public, and much slower, and I need you to understand there is no shame in choosing the first option. I thought about Diane introducing me, for 9 years, as Bradley's wife. She does something with numbers. I thought about the gala Diane was already planning, 4 months out, for the company's 66th anniversary and her own 62nd birthday combined. A black tie event for 400 guests at the Whalen, the same kind of grand, borrowed glamour room where I'd met Bradley in the first place. I want the second option, I said, and I want it to happen at that party. I called my father that same night from the parking garage beneath Margot's office building, sitting in my car for 11 minutes before I could bring myself to turn the key, and I told him everything, start to finish, in the flat, sequential recitation I'd use for a case summary, because it was the only way I could get through it without my voice breaking. Richard Voss did not say, "I'm sorry," and he did not say, "I told you so," though I know, now, that some part of him had quietly suspected Bradley's finances didn't add up years earlier, back at our wedding, when he'd asked me once, offhand, over coffee, whether the Marsh Boys family business was doing as well as everyone said, a question I'd waved off at the time as my father's occupational paranoia. Instead, he asked me 3 questions, the same 3 questions he'd apparently asked every junior examiner he'd ever trained in 31 years at the Attorney General's office. Do you have the transfer records? Do you have a paper trail connecting the transfers to a specific person's decision-making? And can you prove, beyond your own certainty, that the money moved where you think it moved? I answered yes to all 3, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Then you don't need my help, Elena. You need a good forensic partner and a good attorney, and it sounds like you already found both. Just don't let this become about hurting them. Let it be about the truth being complete. The hurting takes care of itself when the truth is complete enough." I have thought about that sentence more times in the last 11 months than almost anything else anyone said to me during the entire ordeal, because it turned out to be precisely correct. One of the discoveries in that process deserves its own telling, because it was the moment the case stopped being abstract numbers on a spreadsheet and became, for me, unbearably specific in a new way. In late May, Priya traced the $22,000 jewelry purchase to a small, high-end store on Madison Avenue, and Margot, through a carefully worded records request, obtained the actual sales receipt, and more importantly, the item description. A pair of emerald drop earrings purchased in February, 11 months into the affair according to our best reconstruction of the timeline, on a date that I recognized instantly without needing to check anything, because it was 3 days after my own birthday, a birthday for which Bradley had given me, that year, a scarf from a department store that I remembered him seeming distracted while presenting, mentioning something about wanting to get you something more special this year, but the timing didn't work out. I sat with that discovery for a long time, alone in my apartment, doing the specific, cruel arithmetic that comes easily to a forensic accountant, and cruelly to a wronged wife simultaneously. My husband had, in the same week he gave his own wife a department store scarf, purchased emerald earrings for another woman, and had constructed, on the spot, a plausible excuse for the discrepancy that I had accepted without a second thought. Because accepting explanations without a second thought had, by that point, become the entire operating architecture of our marriage. I did not cry over the earrings. I added them to the timeline, in the correct color, on the correct date, and I felt, doing it, something colder and more useful than grief, the specific, motivating clarity of watching a pattern complete itself. The technical work Priya Anand did over those following weeks deserves more detail than I initially gave it, because I think people watching this who've never worked in forensic accounting imagine the process as something closer to a detective montage, a magnifying glass over a receipt, a eureka moment, when the actual work is slower, more procedural, and, in its own way, more satisfying, precisely because of how methodical it is. Priya built what's called a source and use analysis, tracing every dollar that entered Marsh Family Holdings LLC back to its originating account and forward to its ultimate destination, cross-referenced against timestamps, memo lines, and, where memo lines were deliberately vague, against secondary corroborating evidence like calendar invitations, email chains, and, in 3 cases, geolocation metadata embedded in photo files that Bradley had, with a carelessness that still amazes me for a man who thought he was being clever, never bothered to strip before sending images to Courtney over a messaging app I gained lawful access to as a joint account holder on the family cellular plan. She built a chronological ledger, color-coded by destination, hotel expenses in 1 shade of amber, jewelry in a second, the Vanessa transfers in a third, that eventually printed when we finally laid the whole thing out on Margot's conference table in early July. across 6 full pages taped together into a single continuous timeline nearly 9 feet long, a physical object that Margot, only half joking, told me she wanted to frame and hang in her office as the cleanest piece of forensic storytelling I've seen walk through this door in a decade. I remember standing over that 9-foot timeline, looking at 9 months of my husband's life laid out in color-coded rectangles, and feeling something that was almost, strangely, professional pride. The specific satisfaction of watching a hypothesis you've built carefully, piece by piece, resolve into an airtight, undeniable structure. A feeling I recognized immediately, because it was the exact same feeling I chased in every single case I'd ever worked for a client. Except this time, for the first time in my career, the fraud belonged to my own house. What followed was 5 months of the strangest performance of my life. And I say that as someone who has spent a career watching other people perform normalcy over the wreckage of their own frauds. I finally understood from the inside exactly how exhausting it is to smile at people you are quietly building a case against. I did not confront Bradley. I did not change my behavior toward him in any way that would have alerted a careful observer. And Bradley, it turns out, was not a careful observer of me, which was, in its own way, the most damning evidence of our entire marriage. A man who had spent 9 years married to a forensic accountant and never once considered that she might notice things. I continued to make him dinner 3 nights a week. I continued to ask him over that dinner how his day was and to listen, with what I can only describe as clinical patience, to his descriptions of closing in on business development leads that Priya Anand and I both knew, by that point, existed nowhere except in the fictional expense reports funding a hotel room account for a 26-year-old marketing coordinator. The family functions were the hardest part, and also, in hindsight, the most useful, because Margot had asked me to keep attending every single one, taking mental notes, because patterns of behavior over multiple observed instances make a far stronger narrative for a judge, and eventually for a jury, than a single dramatic anecdote. So I went to Sunday dinner at Diane's house in Rye 11 times over those 5 months, and I want to walk you through 2 of them specifically, because they show you exactly who Diane Marsh was, consistently, without a single deviation, the entire time her son was funding an affair with company money she was legally responsible for overseeing. The first was in March, 7 weeks after the train, at a Sunday dinner where Diane had hired a private chef for no occasion at all beyond, as she put it, treating ourselves. Because life is short and we deserve nice things. A sentence I found darkly funny, given that I now knew, to the dollar, how much of "we deserve nice things" was actually Elena's household income and a shell company draining her husband's family business. Diane spent the appetizer course explaining to the private chef, a soft-spoken man named Marcus who had trained, he mentioned once, at a well-regarded culinary program, that his beurre blanc needed more acid, dear, the way they do it properly in France. Despite Diane having, to my direct knowledge, visited France exactly once, for 4 days, in 1987. She spent the main course informing the table that Marsh & Sons had never in 66 years missed a payroll, not once, through 2 recessions. A claim I sat and absorbed in silence, my fork perfectly still, knowing from Priya's most recent report that the company had, in fact, drawn against its revolving credit line twice in the preceding quarter specifically to cover a payroll shortfall that Diane herself had approved, having been told by Bradley, in a conversation I now had documented from a forwarded email chain, that it was a timing issue, nothing structural. Diane corrected my pronunciation of a wine region, Sancerre, spoken correctly, in my opinion, by someone who had actually studied French in college, unlike Diane, in front of 11 people, smiling the entire time, the specific bloodless smile of someone for whom being right in public is a form of oxygen. When I mentioned, gently, testing the water the way Margot had coached me to, that I'd read an article about rising interest rates affecting construction lending, Diane waved her hand, actual physical dismissal, and said, "Oh, Elena, that's not really our world, dear. We're much more insulated than these little companies you read about." And I thought, with a calm that frightened me slightly even as I felt it, that Diane Marsh's entire net worth existed almost exclusively as a story she told herself at dinner parties, propped up in actual, material fact by her insurance principal, and by a daughter-in-law she had spent 9 years describing as someone who does something with numbers. The second scene with Diane came in May, at a smaller lunch, just the 2 of us, which she had requested, a rarity, ostensibly to discuss gift ideas for Bradley's upcoming birthday. We sat at a restaurant in Rye with a water view, and 40 minutes into a conversation about centerpiece flowers for the anniversary gala, Diane set down her fork, looked at me with an expression I had genuinely never seen her wear before. something almost like calculation, and said, "You know, Elena, Walter's policy was quite substantial, and I've been thinking, now that the gala planning is underway, that perhaps it's time the family had a real conversation about long-term security. For all of us." I asked her, as neutrally as I have ever asked a question in my life, what she meant by that. "Well," Diane said, refilling her own wine without offering me any, "Bradley mentioned you two might want to think about your own home someday, somewhere with more land, and I thought, wouldn't it be lovely if the family could help with that, the way families do?" I understood, sitting in that restaurant, exactly what was happening. Diane was laying groundwork months in advance for a request to draw further against an insurance principal I now had strong reason to believe was already significantly depleted. And she was doing it by dangling, in front of me specifically, the one thing she knew I might still, foolishly, want enough to keep writing checks. A home, a future, a version of permanence with her son. I smiled at her, the same bloodless, oxygen smile she'd given the wine steward, and said, "That would be lovely, Diane. Let's talk more after the gala." I did not, at that lunch, feel a single flicker of guilt about what I already knew was coming for her at that gala. I felt, if anything, grateful for the confirmation. Vanessa gave me two scenes that mattered just as much, and they showed a different fixed trait entirely, though it braided with Diane's in ways that made the whole family system legible to me for the first time. The first was 6 weeks after the train, at Vanessa's own house, a girls' night she'd organized, ostensibly to plan Diane's gala outfit shopping, where Vanessa spent the first hour of the evening showing me, unprompted, a series of Instagram posts about a new wellness coaching certification she was pursuing. A 6-week online course costing $4,000 that she described as basically starting my own business. Finally, doing something for myself. And then, in the very same breath, asked whether I thought Bradley might be willing to help out a little with the course fee, since, and I am quoting her directly because I wrote it down in the car 20 minutes later, word for word, "You guys have so much more flexibility than us right now, and family should help family. That's just what we do." I told her I'd talk to Bradley. I did not tell her that I now knew, with documentary certainty, that family helping family in the Marsh household ran in exactly one direction, and it wasn't the direction Vanessa was describing. The second Vanessa scene came in July, at a birthday lunch for Chad, of all people, where Vanessa spent 20 minutes complaining, at volume, to the table, about a contractor who had failed to finish a kitchen renovation on time, a renovation, I now knew from the property records Margot's office had pulled, that had been substantially funded by the $81,000 laundered through Marsh Family Holdings LLC as a fictitious sibling consulting fee. Vanessa described the contractor as basically stealing from us at this point, with real, genuine outrage in her voice, sincere outrage, the specific unself-conscious outrage of a person who has never once applied the same moral framework to her own conduct that she applies instantly and furiously to anyone she believes has wronged her. I sat there, eating a piece of Chad's birthday cake, listening to a woman describe theft as an unforgivable violation while sitting in a kitchen, partially paid for by an actual felonious theft from a company that employed 41 families who were not the Marshes. And I understood something about entitlement that I had not fully articulated to myself before that moment. Entitled people do not believe rules don't apply to them because they think they're above rules. They believe rules don't apply to them because they have never once considered that they might be the person a rule is describing. Chad's two scenes were shorter, because Chad, true to his fixed trait, contributed less to every gathering, including this narrative, than anyone else in the family, which is itself the point. The first came at that same girls' night adjacent gathering in the spring, when Bradley and Chad were meant to be grilling on the back deck and I walked out to refill a water pitcher and found Chad alone, scrolling on his phone, the grill entirely unlit, having apparently been asked to start it 40 minutes earlier. "Oh, is that still not going?" he said, looking up mildly, with no urgency at all, and then, without moving, called into the house for Bradley to come figure out the propane thing. A task that took Bradley, when he finally emerged, 90 seconds to solve, by simply opening a valve Chad had not checked. The second came at Chad's own birthday lunch, the same one where Vanessa complained about the contractor. When I asked Chad, making conversation, how the job search was going, he'd mentioned, months earlier, exploring new opportunities after leaving his most recent commercial real estate position. And Chad said, without a trace of embarrassment, "Honestly, I've kind of just been taking some time, figuring out what I actually want. Life's too short to rush into the wrong thing," while eating a slice of cake purchased, like the kitchen renovation, substantially with money his wife had received from a fraud my husband was committing. A fraud Chad had, at minimum, benefited from with the specific, comfortable passivity of a man who has never asked a single hard question about where anything in his life actually comes from, because asking would require doing something, and doing something was the one behavior Chad Cole had structured his entire adult life to avoid. There was a third scene with Diane that I haven't mentioned yet, one that happened in June, at the company's annual Founders Day barbecue held every year on the anniversary of Walter's very first dump truck purchase, an event Diane insisted on catering herself, badly. With a hired grill staff she then critiqued openly in front of guests. I watched her that afternoon spend 20 minutes explaining to a young intern from the accounting department, a nervous 22-year-old named Priya, a different Priya, a coincidence that struck me hard enough that I wrote it down that same night. Exactly how real family businesses operated on trust rather than excessive bureaucratic oversight. A philosophy she delivered while standing 11 feet from a company ledger that Bradley had, at that exact point in the timeline, already used to divert $71,000 through 8 separate falsified expense approvals. The intern nodded along, taking mental notes on how to run a company, from a woman whose own understanding of the company's actual financial position was, by that point, built almost entirely on things she wanted to be true rather than things that were. There was a third scene with Vanessa too, smaller than the others, but somehow the one that stuck with me longest. At a nail salon appointment we'd booked together months earlier, before any of this started, that I did not cancel, because Margot had advised maintaining every normal-seeming appointment on my calendar. Vanessa spent the entire hour discussing, in detail, a friend of hers whose husband had been caught in an affair, delivering a scathing, righteous monologue about how you'd have to be an idiot not to see the signs. I mean, come on, financial secrets, weird hours, it's always the same story. Entirely unaware that she was describing, almost point for point, her own brother's conduct, and entirely unaware that the woman sitting in the pedicure chair beside her had, by that point, already built a 9-foot timeline of exactly those signs. I said nothing. I let her paint my toenails a color called Cassandra red, an irony so complete I nearly laughed out loud in the chair, and I tipped generously, and I went home and added the conversation to my notes, dated, time-stamped, one more small brick in a wall I was building, with a patience that surprised even me. Chad's third scene came at a company function in late July, a groundbreaking ceremony for one of the 3 active developments, where Chad showed up an hour late, missed the actual ceremonial shovel photo entirely, and spent the reception telling anyone who'd listen about a big opportunity he was looking into, a vague reference to some unspecified venture that, 8 months later, I would learn from Vanessa's own panicked phone call, had never progressed past a single introductory phone call Chad had taken and then never followed up on, because following up, I had come to understand by that point, was a category of effort Chad Cole's entire nervous system had simply opted out of somewhere in his mid-20s. By August, Priya Anand's file ran to over 400 pages of documented transfers, forwarded emails, property records, and a full reconstruction of Marsh Family Holdings LLC's cash flows, cross-referenced against Marsh & Sons' internal accounting in a way that made the diversion undeniable to anyone who understood how to read a general ledger, which, conveniently, described exactly 2 people in this story. And the Assistant U.S. Attorney Margot had finally, formally, introduced me to, in a conference room on Pearl Street on a Thursday afternoon in early August, a woman named Devin Okafor, who reviewed 40 pages of Priya's summary exhibit in near total silence for 11 minutes before looking up at me and saying, "This is one of the cleaner referral packages I've seen walk in that door in a long time. Who built this?" "I did," I said. "It's what I do." Devin Okafor did not promise me anything that afternoon beyond an active review, which, she was careful to explain, was not the same as an indictment and could take months to move through the appropriate channels: grand jury subpoenas, additional documentation requests to the bank, coordination with the FBI's white-collar squad on the interstate wire component. I understood that. I had built cases like this one from the other side of the table for a decade. What I did not fully understand, walking out of that building onto Pearl Street into the thick, wet heat of a New York August, was how strange it would feel to finally hand my own life over to a process I usually only administered for strangers, and to have to wait, the way clients always waited on me, not knowing exactly when, or how, the machine I'd built would finally turn. If you've ever sat on information that could change everything, and had to keep setting the table for Sunday dinner anyway, keep smiling at a mother-in-law's wine correction, keep saying, "Good, how was yours?" To a husband whose double life you could recite by dollar amount and date. Comment one word below for what you'd have done differently in my position. And subscribe now, because the next part of this story is where all 3 of those loops I opened on that train start closing, one at a time, and none of them close quietly. The personal loop closed first, in September, and it closed in a hotel lobby, not a courtroom, because Margot had advised me that filing for divorce before the federal referral matured could tip Bradley off that something larger than a marriage was ending, so we needed the marital dissolution to look, from the outside, like an ordinary, quiet, private failure. A woman who'd simply had enough, right up until the exact moment it wasn't private at all. I chose the Aria Grand on Lexington on purpose. I called ahead and confirmed, using a name I won't dignify by repeating, that room 1408 was booked for a Thursday evening, the same recurring slot Priya's transaction analysis had shown Bradley favored nearly every 3rd week for 8 months. And I sat in the lobby, in a chair with a clear sightline to the elevator bank, for 40 minutes, drinking a club soda I did not want, until I watched Bradley Marsh walk in at 6:52 in a jacket I had bought him for his 40th birthday, holding the door for a young woman in a green dress, who I recognized instantly from a LinkedIn profile photo I had looked at more times than I care to admit over the preceding 5 months. Courtney Blaze was smaller in person than I'd imagined, and younger looking, and she laughed at something Bradley said in the elevator lobby with her whole face, an open, unguarded laugh, and I remember thinking, with a clarity that surprised me, that I did not hate her the way I thought I would. I hated Bradley. Courtney was a symptom. Bradley was the disease. I want to describe that lobby a little more fully, because I've replayed it so many times that the details have become almost unnaturally sharp in my memory, the way certain scenes from your own life eventually take on the crystalline, overlit quality of something staged rather than lived. The Aria Grand's lobby has a floor of dark polished marble veined with gold, a scent I later learned was a signature diffuser blend the hotel piped through its ventilation system, something woody and slightly citrus, and a pianist playing quiet standards near the concierge desk who happened, that evening, to be playing a version of a song Bradley and I had danced to at our own wedding. A coincidence so cruel and so perfectly cinematic that I remember almost laughing out loud at the sheer unlikelihood of it. Sitting there in a chair with a club soda, waiting to watch my husband walk in with another woman, while a pianist, entirely unaware of the small catastrophe unfolding 12 feet away from him, played our first dance. I noted, with the same clinical part of my brain that had built 400 pages of forensic documentation, the exact time on the lobby clock when they walked in, 6:52, which matched, almost to the minute, 3 separate calendar entries Priya had already flagged from Bradley's own phone, entries labeled, with a carelessness I still find almost impressive in its total absence of self-preservation instinct, BM, initials I'd assumed for months, before that evening, stood for some kind of building materials vendor. I did not confront them there. I want to be honest about why. It would have been satisfying for approximately 90 seconds, and it would have cost me the element of surprise I needed for everything still ahead. Instead, I stood up, walked directly past them both, close enough that Bradley's eyes met mine over Courtney's shoulder, for exactly 1.5 seconds. I know because I counted it later. Replaying it. The way you replay the worst and best moments of your life with equal, helpless precision. And I said nothing at all. I simply held his gaze until his face went the particular gray-white color of a man doing very fast, very bad arithmetic about how much I might know, and then I walked out onto Lexington Avenue and called Margot from the sidewalk, my voice, to my own surprise, completely level. "It's confirmed," I said. "Personally, not just financially. I saw them together." Margot was quiet for a moment. "How do you feel?" she asked, which was so unlike her, so far outside her usual register of pure strategy, that I almost laughed. "Ready," I told her. "I feel ready." Bradley came home that night at 11:40, 40 minutes later than he'd told me, smelling faintly of a perfume that was not mine, and I was sitting at the kitchen island with a cup of tea I'd let go cold, and I watched him decide, in real time, whether to lie, and then watched him lie anyway, because lying was the only muscle Bradley Marsh had ever actually built in 9 years of marriage. "Client dinner ran long," he said, not quite meeting my eyes, reaching for a glass of water he didn't need, a physical excuse to turn away from me. "Which client?" I asked, keeping my voice exactly, carefully neutral. The voice I use in a deposition when I already know the answer and want to watch how badly someone mangles the lie. "Just the Hartford Group, the retail development thing," he said. "A project that did not exist." that I had confirmed did not exist 11 weeks earlier when I'd searched Marsh & Son's active pipeline in a database Diane herself had once shown me, proudly, as evidence of the company's robust growth trajectory. I said, okay, and I went to bed, and I lay awake next to my husband for the last time in my life, listening to him fall asleep within minutes. The specific, infuriating sleep of a guilty man who has successfully told himself one more time that he's gotten away with it. Before I filed anything, I did one more thing that I think matters to this story, even though it happened quietly, privately, in a way none of the Marshes ever knew about until much later, if they ever fully understood it at all. I called my closest friend from graduate school, a woman named Sophia Reyes Nakamura, who now runs compliance for a hedge fund in Boston. Someone who had watched me marry into the Marsh family from a slight skeptical distance for 9 years without ever saying anything critical out loud. Because that's the kind of friend Sophia is. She waits to be asked. I told her everything, over a 2-hour phone call on a Sunday afternoon in September, sitting on my own back porch with a glass of wine I barely touched, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Elena, I need to tell you something, and I need you to not be angry at me for waiting this long to say it. I never trusted how easily that family took your money. Every single time you mentioned covering something, the loan payoff, the down payment, Vanessa's $4,000 for a course she never finished, I kept thinking, this is a family that has figured out exactly how far Elena will bend before she breaks, and they keep testing the same number over and over, and you keep proving the number is higher than they thought." I sat on that porch and let the accuracy of that observation settle into me slowly, painfully, the way true things about yourself always do. Because Sophia was right, and she had been right for years, and I had simply never let myself hear it from anyone, including myself, until a phone call from a subway car had made the alternative, continuing to bend, finally, permanently impossible. I filed the following Monday, not for divorce yet, Margot advised, waiting 3 more weeks for a specific procedural reason I'll get to, but for a legal separation, quietly, through a filing that would not require Bradley to be served in person, that would simply arrive by mail at the Rye office of the family attorney Diane had used for decades. A man named Harold Trask, who was 73 years old, had drafted Walter Marsh's original will, and who, Margot assured me with something close to relish, has absolutely no idea what he's about to be handling. There was one Sunday dinner in that same stretch of weeks that I haven't told you about yet, and I think it belongs here, because it shows exactly how thin the family's collective denial had become by that point, even before anyone had received a single piece of paper. Diane hosted, as always, and spent a good portion of the meal talking, unprompted, about a wonderful new client relationship Bradley was supposedly cultivating, describing it in the vague, celebratory language she always used for business developments she'd never actually seen documentation of. And I sat there, eating a piece of Marcus the private chef's lamb, thinking about the 12-page clean summary exhibit sitting in a folder in Margot's office, thinking about the 9-foot timeline, thinking about how strange it was to sit at a table with 5 people who believed, with total unshaken confidence, that they understood the shape of their own family's finances, when I alone, silently, held a more complete and accurate picture of that family's economic reality than any of them, including Diane, who had actually lived inside it for 61 years. Vanessa asked me, that same dinner, almost as an afterthought between courses, whether Bradley and I had worked things out yet, and I said, "We're figuring it out," which was, I suppose, technically true, in the sense that a federal grand jury was, at that exact moment, in the process of figuring quite a lot of it out on my behalf. The days between filing and Bradley actually receiving the papers were the strangest of the entire 11 months, because I was still, technically, living in the same house as him, sleeping in the same bed some nights out of sheer inertia and exhaustion, still cooking the same dinners, still enduring the same family functions, all while a legal document was moving through the mail system that would end his understanding of his entire life. I want to tell you about the last real conversation we had before the papers arrived, because it's the one that made me understand, finally, completely, without any residual sentiment, that I owed this man nothing further. We were sitting on the back porch, a Tuesday evening in late September, and Bradley, apropos of nothing, said, "You know, Elena, I've been thinking, maybe we should think about starting a family soon. I know we've put it off for the business and your career and everything, but Vanessa was saying, you know, life's short and my mom would really love grandkids before." And he trailed off, gesturing vaguely at the idea of Diane's mortality, and I sat there, Looking at a man who had spent the preceding 9 months funneling company money to a mistress's hotel room and his own sister's mortgage, discussing the possibility of bringing a child into a marriage he had already, materially and emotionally, abandoned. And I understood, with total finality, that Bradley Marsh did not see me as a person whose interior life required his consideration. He saw me as an infrastructure, reliable, load-bearing, permanent. The way you see a foundation you never think about because it has simply never failed you before. "Let's talk about it after the gala," I said, which had become, without my planning it exactly this way, my standard answer to everyone in that family for anything they wanted from me after the gala. I had started, without fully articulating it to myself, to think of the gala as a deadline, a hard, immovable date on which every single deferred conversation in that family's life would finally be forced to happen at once, whether they wanted it to or not. The papers reached Harold Trask's office on a Thursday in early October. Bradley called me at 2:14 that afternoon, and I let it go to voicemail and listened to it twice before deleting it. A message that started angry. "Elena, what the hell is this? Is this some kind of joke?" And ended 40 seconds later in a register I had genuinely never heard from him before. Something close to actual fear, his voice cracking slightly on the word, "please." I felt, listening to it, exactly one flicker of the old reflex, the 9-year habit of wanting to fix whatever was upsetting my husband. And then I felt it pass through me and out, like a fever breaking. And underneath it, there was nothing left but the cool, clear, professional focus I bring to closing out a file. Loop B, the personal betrayal, was, for my own purposes, closed. I knew everything I needed to know about who Bradley Marsh was and what he had done to our marriage. What remained open, and what I had structured every single decision of the preceding 7 months to protect, was the timing of Loop A, because Devin Okafor had called Margot's office that same week, the same week the separation papers landed, with 4 words that changed the shape of everything still to come. The grand jury convened. A federal grand jury does not move at the speed of a betrayed spouse's impatience, and I learned, over the following 6 weeks, a new kind of discipline, waiting on a process that was, for the first time in my professional life, entirely outside my own control. Devin Okafor's office had, by late October, subpoenaed the full banking records of Marsh Family Holdings, LLC directly from the Delaware registered agent and the receiving bank, subpoenaed Marsh & Sons' complete general ledger for the preceding 2 fiscal years. And this was the detail that told me the investigation had moved from reviewing a referral to building an indictment. Interviewed 2 forensic accountants from the FBI's New York field office, who spent 3 full days on site at the Marsh & Sons offices in White Plains, ostensibly as part of a routine compliance audit that Diane, according to a call Vanessa made to me in a moment of genuine panic in early November, described to the rest of the family as some kind of paperwork thing, nothing to worry about, Harold's handling it. I want to tell you about that call from Vanessa, because it's the moment I understood the family's collective capacity for denial had a ceiling, and they were starting to hit it. She called me at 9:40 on a Tuesday night, her voice tight in a way I'd never heard before, and said, "Elena, I know things are weird with you and Bradley right now, but did you know anything about the company having some kind of federal thing happening? Chad heard from a guy he knows at the bank that there's some kind of investigation, and I'm freaking out, and my mom won't tell me anything, and you're good with this stuff, can you just tell me if this is actually serious?" I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment, genuinely weighing, for the first time in months, whether to say something. And then I thought about the $81,000, and the kitchen renovation, and family helping family, and I said, in a voice I kept perfectly gentle, perfectly warm, the voice of a sister-in-law who still cared, "I really don't know anything more than you do, Vanessa. I'm sure Harold has it under control." It was, I want to be clear, the only outright lie I told during the entire investigation, and I do not regret it even slightly, because Vanessa Marsh Cole had spent 9 years treating my professional expertise as a party trick to be deployed on her behalf whenever convenient, and I was not going to hand it to her one final time, for free, the one time it might have actually saved her. Devin Okafor called Margot directly on November 19th, a date I will remember for the rest of my life the way some people remember wedding anniversaries, to confirm that the grand jury had returned a sealed indictment against Bradley Thomas Marsh, individually, on 3 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, based on the interstate transfers routed through Marsh Family Holdings, LLC. Diane Marsh, Okafor explained in a follow-up conversation that included me directly for the first time, given my status as both a material witness and, formally, the referring party, was named in a separate, related civil forfeiture action targeting company assets traceable to the fraud, but had not, at that point, been criminally charged herself. The evidence of Diane's direct knowledge, while damning in a civil and reputational sense, had not yet crossed the specific evidentiary threshold prosecutors needed for a criminal charge against her personally, a fact that frustrated me for exactly one evening before Margot reminded me, sharply, that I did not get to decide the outcome. I only got to make sure the facts were complete and clean, and the facts, complete and clean, had already done 90% of the work I'd set out to do 7 months earlier. The timing question, when exactly an indictment against Bradley would be unsealed and an arrest would follow, became the single most delicate negotiation of the entire process, because Devin Okafor's office operated on its own schedule, driven by procedural requirements, coordination with the FBI's arrest logistics, and prosecutorial discretion that had nothing to do with anyone's sense of dramatic timing, including mine. But Margot, who I now understood had been quietly, patiently working an angle for weeks that she'd never fully explained to me until that point, had one more card to play. "Devin," Margot said, on a call I sat in on from her office in late November, "I'm going to ask you for something unusual, and I want you to tell me honestly if it's not possible. No hard feelings. There's a public event, December 14th, a black tie gala, 400 guests at the Whalen in Brooklyn. The entire Marsh family will be there, including Bradley, including Diane, including the mistress who is still employed by the company, and, per the guest list Elena has seen, is attending as a company representative. If the arrest logistics can accommodate a public location without compromising officer safety or the integrity of the operation, is there any version of this where the unsealing happens there?" I remember holding my breath because I had not, until that exact moment, actually asked anyone to do this. I had simply wanted the gala to be a deadline in my own mind, a private, symbolic marker, and I had not realized Margot had been building, in parallel with everything else, the actual architecture to make it real. Devin Okafor was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, in the dry, careful tone of a prosecutor who has clearly done this calculation before, "That's not typical, but it's not against protocol either, if the location and crowd size can be secured appropriately. And frankly," she added, and I could hear, for the first time, something almost like amusement under the professionalism, "given what this family has apparently spent 9 months performing in public, there's a certain symmetry to a public resolution. Let me talk to the arrest coordination team." I spent the first 2 weeks of December doing something I had never once, in my entire career, done for a client, because I had never once been the client. I helped plan the exact choreography of my own husband's public arrest, down to logistical details most people never think about, sitting across a conference table from an assistant U.S. attorney and 2 FBI agents from the white-collar squad, one of them a soft-spoken, methodical agent named Tom Reyes who reminded me, unsettlingly, of my father, discussing exactly which exit at the Whalen the agents would use, exactly what time in the evening's program would minimize risk to the catering staff and other uninvolved guests, exactly how the civil forfeiture notice against Marsh & Sons accounts would be served simultaneously to Harold Trask, so that Diane could not, even for a single hour, move money once the public spectacle began. I remember Agent Reyes asking me, near the end of that final planning meeting, whether I wanted to be present in the room when it happened or whether I'd prefer to be elsewhere, out of an abundance of consideration for what he clearly assumed would be an emotionally difficult moment for me. I told him the truth. "I've spent 7 months building this case," I said. "I'm not missing the ending." He looked at me for a moment, the specific look I imagine he reserves for the rare witnesses who surprise him, and then he nodded, once, and said, "Understood. We'll make sure you have a clean sightline." The 2 weeks before the gala were the longest of my life, and I want to walk you through them slowly because tension, real tension, is not one dramatic beat. It's 100 small, mundane moments that all carry an unbearable second weight underneath them. I still lived, technically, in the Bronxville house during that period, though Bradley had moved into a spare room 2 doors down the hall, an arrangement neither of us had explicitly negotiated so much as arrived at through the accumulated exhaustion of 2 people who no longer had anything true left to say to each other. He was quieter during those 2 weeks than I'd ever known him to be, and I understood, watching him, that some animal part of him sensed a reckoning approaching even though he had no specific information about its shape. He asked me twice in that period whether we could try counseling, a request I found almost unbearably ironic given that the counselor he was proposing would have needed a forensic accounting degree more than a therapy license to address the actual structure of what was wrong between us. I told him both times that I needed time to think, which was true in the narrowest possible sense. I had, in fact, thought about almost nothing else for 7 months, while omitting the much larger truth that there was nothing left in me to think about, because the thinking had already produced its conclusion months earlier, and what remained was only execution. Diane called me 3 times during those 2 weeks, an unusual frequency for her, always with some pretext related to gala logistics. Did I have preferences about seating? Would I be bringing a +1 now that things were complicated with Bradley? A question she asked with a delicacy so thin I could see the anxious calculation underneath it. The fear of a public embarrassment at her own anniversary party outweighing, even now, any actual curiosity about why her son's marriage was ending. On the second call, Diane said something that I wrote down verbatim in my notes that evening, because it captured, more precisely than almost anything else in this story, the exact shape of her arrogance. I do hope whatever's going on between you two gets sorted before the 14th, Elena. It would mean so much to the family's image to present a united front, especially with some of the bank's board members attending. You understand, appearances matter enormously at this stage for the company. I told her I understood completely, and I meant it in a way she could not have anticipated, because I understood, with perfect clarity, precisely how much appearances were about to stop mattering for the Marsh family's image, permanently, and precisely which board members from which bank would be watching it happen from 4 feet away. Courtney Blaze, meanwhile, remained, throughout those 2 weeks, entirely unaware that anything beyond an ordinary marital separation was occurring, a fact I confirmed, indirectly, through a single strange encounter at the Marsh & Sons holiday planning meeting for the gala, which I attended, at Diane's insistence, in my capacity as still technically family until the paperwork is final, dear. Courtney was there, coordinating vendor logistics with the visible, slightly frantic competence of someone trying to prove her indispensability. And at one point, refilling a coffee at a side table, she said to me, with what I can only describe as genuine, oblivious warmth, "I just think it's so nice that you're still coming, even with everything going on with you and Bradley. Family's family, right?" I looked at this 26-year-old woman holding a coffee cup with a hand that wore, I now noticed for the first time in person, a bracelet I recognized instantly from a photograph on a phone I'd found by accident 9 months earlier, and I said, "Family's family," and smiled, and walked away, and did not, for the first time in this entire ordeal, feel a single flicker of anger at her. What I felt, watching Courtney Blaze refill her coffee in complete ignorance of the 2 federal agents who would be standing 8 feet from her in 14 days, was something closer to pity. The specific, cold pity you feel for a person who has built a small, precarious structure on land they do not know is about to be seized. There was one meeting in that final stretch that nearly derailed the entire plan, and I think it's worth telling honestly, because I don't want this story to sound like every single decision I made in those months was executed with flawless, cinematic confidence. Some of them were, and some of them were the product of real doubt, argued out loud, in real time, with people I trusted enough to disagree with me. It happened on December 8th, 6 days before the gala, when Devin Okafor's office called an unexpected conference with Margot to flag a complication. The specific public arrest arrangement carried a non-zero risk, in the U.S. Attorney's own internal assessment, that a sympathetic defense attorney could later argue the timing and location had been engineered for maximum public humiliation rather than legitimate law enforcement purposes. A framing that, while unlikely to affect the underlying criminal case given the strength of the documentary evidence, could complicate sentencing arguments around Bradley's cooperation and remorse. Margot relayed this to me over the phone that evening, and I remember sitting on the floor of my closet, of all places, surrounded by 3 different gown options I hadn't yet chosen between, feeling something close to real fear for the first time in months. Not fear of Bradley, but fear that my own desire for a specific, symbolic kind of justice might actually damage the clean, procedurally sound case I'd spent 7 months protecting from exactly that kind of contamination. "Tell me honestly," I said to Margot, "if this creates even a 5% risk to the actual conviction, I don't want it. I built this to be right, not to be satisfying." Margot was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "That's exactly the right question to ask, and it's why I've spent 30 years trusting you with things I don't trust most clients with. Let me call Devin back." She called Devin Okafor back that same night, and the 2 of them worked out a modification I hadn't anticipated. The agents would identify themselves as making a standard, unannounced arrest that happened to occur at Bradley's known location that evening, with no public statement of any kind from law enforcement acknowledging awareness of the venue's significance. meaning that from a legal and procedural standpoint, the arrest would look, on paper, exactly like any other arrest executed wherever a subject happened to be found. The fact that the subject happened to be found in front of 400 witnesses at his own family's gala would be, technically, incidental. I agreed to that framing immediately, relieved, because it let me keep the outcome I wanted without asking the case itself to bend around my own need for narrative closure. A distinction Margot told me, afterward, that very few people going through what you're going through are disciplined enough to insist on. Margot and I met 4 times in those final 2 weeks, each meeting shorter and more procedural than the last, because by that point, the actual work was largely finished. What remained was logistics, and the particular, quiet discipline of not letting 7 months of careful, patient construction collapse in the final stretch through some unnecessary, emotional misstep. She walked me through, in granular detail, exactly what would happen on the night of the 14th. Agent Reyes and a second agent, a woman named Carla Diaz, would be present at the Wayland from the beginning of the cocktail hour. Positioned as ordinary guests, credentialed through a cover arrangement Margot had helped coordinate with the event's actual security company. The civil forfeiture papers freezing Marsh & Sons operating accounts and the personal accounts traceable to the fraud would be served on Harold Trask's office at exactly 7:45 that evening, time to prevent any last-minute asset movement once the arrest began. And the arrest itself, contingent entirely on final approval from Devin Okafor's office, which came through, finally, on December 12th, 2 days before the event, would occur during the dinner program, after the anniversary toasts, but before dessert service. A specific window Agent Reyes had selected because it was the moment. According to the event's own run-of-show document that Diane's event planner had circulated to the family weeks earlier, when the entire room would be seated, attentive, and facing the head table. I want to tell you about the dress, because choosing it turned into its own strange, small ritual of that final week. I went to a boutique on Madison Avenue on December 9th, 5 days before the gala, and tried on 11 gowns before settling on the dark green one. And the saleswoman, a kind, perceptive woman in her 50s named Odette, who had clearly sold enough gowns to enough women in enough different emotional states to read a room without being told anything, asked me, gently, after the 7th or 8th dress, "Is this for something difficult or something you're looking forward to?" I told her, honestly, both, actually. And she nodded like that made perfect sense, which I suppose it did. The green one, when I finally put it on, did something I hadn't expected. It made me feel, for the first time in months, entirely like myself, rather than like a wife, a plaintiff, a witness, or a case manager, just a woman in a well-cut dress the color of something growing rather than something ending. And I bought it on the spot, in cash, a small symbolic insistence to myself that at least one transaction in this entire ordeal would be simple, clean, and entirely unambiguously mine. I did not sleep more than 4 hours a night during that final week. Not from anxiety exactly, but from a kind of hyper-alert clarity that felt almost chemical. My body running on the specific adrenaline I recognized from the handful of times in my career I'd testified in a case I knew, with total certainty, that I was going to win. I ran through the timeline obsessively, the way I imagine athletes visualize a race before running it. The toasts, the served papers, the agents moving through the crowd, my own position at the table, the exact words I intended to say if given even 30 seconds in front of that room before the machinery of federal law enforcement took over entirely and rendered anything I might say largely irrelevant to the outcome, if not to my own sense of closure. Margot had advised against any kind of personal statement, worried it could complicate witness credibility down the line, and I had agreed, in that meeting, to defer to her judgment completely, and then spent every night that week writing and deleting the same 4 sentences anyway, because some part of me, the part that had spent 9 years being introduced as the practical one, needed, at minimum, to know what those sentences would have been, even if I never said them out loud. There is one more piece of preparation I have to tell you about before I get to that morning, because it's the piece that made the entire evening possible logistically, and it took nearly the full 2 weeks to assemble properly. Margot, Priya, and I spent 3 separate sessions in early December building what Margot called the Clean Summary Exhibit, a 12-page document stripped of legal jargon, organized purely by dollar amount and date, designed specifically so that if I ever did get even 30 seconds in front of that room, or in front of a reporter afterward, or in front of anyone at all who needed the simplest possible version of an extraordinarily complicated fraud, I would have language ready that couldn't be twisted, minimized, or spun by a family that had spent 66 years mastering the art of spin. I memorized parts of it the way I once memorized closing arguments for moot court in graduate school, not because Margot wanted me delivering a speech, she was explicit, repeatedly, that she did not, but because I needed, for my own sense of completion, to know I could explain what happened to my own marriage in under 2 minutes, cleanly, without a single unnecessary word, the same discipline I demand of every junior analyst I've ever trained. Priya came to my apartment the Sunday before the gala, unannounced, with a bottle of wine and a folder she set on my kitchen counter without a word. Inside was a printed copy of the 9-foot timeline, reduced to fit a single poster board, laminated, in case, she said. You ever want to actually look at it as one complete object instead of scattered across 41 tabs of a spreadsheet. I hung it, that night, on the wall of my home office, where it stayed for the following 4 months until the case fully resolved. A strange, private monument to the worst and most clarifying year of my adult life. And I remember standing in front of it at 11 at night, 2 days before the gala, tracing the amber-colored hotel rectangles with one finger, feeling something I can only describe as gratitude, not for what had happened, never that, but for the specific, rare gift of having a friend whose love language was doing forensic accounting for you at 11 o'clock on a Sunday night, free of charge, because she'd watched you get quietly destroyed for 9 years and finally had the tools to help you stop it. The morning of December 14th, I woke at 5:40, hours before I needed to, in the guest room of the Bronxville house I would list for sale within the month, and I lay in the dark for a long time doing something I had not done once in the preceding 7 months of forensic, disciplined case building. I let myself feel, fully, for exactly 20 minutes, everything I had been holding at arm's length since a subway car under the East River. I grieved in that 20 minutes, not Bradley specifically, not even the marriage specifically, but the version of myself who had once genuinely believed that loving someone completely and being loved back were the same transaction. A version of myself I recognized, lying there, that I would never fully get back, and did not, in the end, particularly want back, because she had been, I could now see clearly, someone who had confused being needed for being valued for 9 consecutive years. Then I got up, showered, dressed in a dark green gown I had bought specifically for that night without telling anyone why, drove into the city, and met Margot for lunch at a quiet restaurant near her office, where she looked at me across the table, assessing, the way she'd assessed me on that very first day 7 months earlier, and said only, "You look ready." I told her the truth. I am. The Whalen, if you've never been, is a converted 19th century bank building in Williamsburg, all soaring gilt ceilings and marble columns and a chandelier the size of a small car hanging over what used to be, 130 years ago, an actual banking hall. A detail I found almost unbearably fitting, standing under it at 6:30 that evening, given what the room was about to witness. 400 guests in black tie, round tables draped in ivory linen, a 12-piece orchestra warming up in the corner, and at the head table, elevated slightly on a small platform, seats reserved for Diane, for Bradley, for Vanessa and Chad, and, because Diane's event planner had, with an irony that still makes something in my chest tighten when I think about it, seated spouses together regardless of current relationship complications, for me. I arrived at 6:45, deliberately 15 minutes after the agents, whom I spotted immediately despite their careful, unremarkable formal wear. Agent Reyes, near the west entrance in a charcoal suit, nursing a club soda he never actually drank, and Agent Diaz, closer to the bar, in a navy gown, laughing at something with the easy, practiced sociability of someone who had clearly done this kind of undercover work before. Bradley greeted me at the table with a stiff, public performance of normalcy, kissing my cheek for the benefit of the guests around us, murmuring, "Thank you for coming, it means a lot to my mom." And I said, "Of course," and sat down beside him, my heart rate, I noted with some professional detachment, remaining almost entirely steady, the way it does in a deposition when you already know every answer that's coming. In the car, on the way to the Whalen, alone, because Bradley had driven separately that evening for reasons neither of us bothered to explain to the other anymore, I called Margot one last time, and she answered on the first ring, as though she'd been waiting with the phone in her hand. "Agent Reyes just confirmed positioning," she said. "Everyone's where they need to be. This is happening exactly the way we planned it." I asked her, in a small voice I barely recognized as my own, the one question I hadn't let myself ask out loud in 7 months of careful, disciplined planning. "Margot, is it going to feel like I think it's going to feel?" She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, with a gentleness I'd rarely heard from her, "I don't know, Elena. I've never seen a case like this one, built by the person it happened to, executed this cleanly. I think it's going to feel like a lot of things at once, and I think you're going to be all right regardless of which of those things ends up being the loudest." I sat with that answer for the remaining 4 minutes of the drive, watching the lit windows of Brooklyn slide past, and by the time the car pulled up outside the Wayland's grand columned entrance, I had made a kind of peace with not knowing exactly what the next 3 hours would feel like, only that I had built, with total, exacting care, every condition necessary for them to unfold the way the truth demanded they unfold. I want to describe the room itself a little more, in the minutes before any of it started, because I think the ordinariness of it is part of what made everything that followed land so hard. There was a raw bar in the corner near the west windows, oysters on ice that nobody had touched yet, a photographer moving quietly along the edges of the room, capturing candid shots for what I assume was intended to be a commemorative anniversary album. A string quartet transitioning into the 12-piece orchestra's first set as the room filled, laughter rising in overlapping waves from a dozen different conversations, the specific, warm, expensive hum of 400 well-dressed people who believe, correctly, that they're about to have a perfectly pleasant evening. I remember standing near the entrance for a moment before finding my seat, watching an elderly couple I didn't recognize, longtime family friends, I'd later learn, who had known Walter Marsh personally in the 1970s, admire an ice sculpture near the dessert table shaped, with an irony I noted immediately, like a small dump truck, a nod to the company's founding story that Diane's event planner had clearly researched and executed with genuine, if misplaced, sincerity. I thought, watching that ice sculpture slowly begin to sweat under the warm ballroom lights, that it would be melted into an unrecognizable puddle by the time dessert service actually arrived. And I remember thinking, with a small, private, slightly grim satisfaction, that the sculpture and the family's public reputation were going to finish the evening in roughly the same condition. Diane worked the room for the first hour like a woman auditioning for her own legacy, moving from table to table in a beaded silver gown, accepting compliments on the venue, on the flowers, on 66 wonderful years, her voice carrying, at one point, across 3 tables when she told a bank board member, a silver-haired man named Franklin Ashworth, whose name I recognized instantly from the very same revolving credit line documentation Priya had spent months tracing, that the family's never been stronger, Franklin. Truly, we're so excited about the next chapter of growth. Franklin Ashworth, I noted, smiled thinly at that and said something I couldn't hear, and Diane's laugh, in response, had a brittle edge to it that told me, even from across the room, that the bank's confidence in Marsh & Son's next chapter of growth was considerably less enthusiastic than Diane was performing for the room. Courtney Blaze arrived at 7:10, in the green dress from the hotel lobby 11 weeks earlier, seated at a table near the back reserved for company staff, and I watched Bradley's eyes find her exactly twice in the first half hour. Brief, practiced, unremarkable glances that anyone not specifically watching for them would never have registered, but that I, having spent 7 months cataloging this man's behavioral patterns with the same rigor I apply to a fraudulent general ledger, clocked instantly both times. Dinner service began at 7:30. At 7:45, precisely on schedule, I watched from my seat at the head table a Marsh & Sons event staffer approach Harold Trask, seated at a nearby table, and hand him an envelope, and I watched Harold Trask's face, under the chandelier light, go through 4 distinct stages in under a minute. Polite confusion, focused reading, dawning comprehension, and finally, a kind of frozen, blood-drained stillness that made him set down his wine glass with a hand that was visibly, slightly shaking. He did not stand up. He did not say anything to anyone at his table. He simply sat there, holding a document that had just frozen every account Marsh & Sons Construction and Development held, along with several personal accounts belonging to Diane and Bradley Marsh. And I understood, watching him, that Harold Trask, 73 years old, 30 years into representing this family, had just realized, in real time, in the middle of a chandelier-lit ballroom, that he had absolutely no idea what he was actually walking into that evening. The toasts began at 8:20. Vanessa's husband, Chad, of all people, gave the first one, a short, notably unprepared few sentences about 66 amazing years of the Marsh family building this incredible legacy, delivered with the visible discomfort of a man who had clearly been asked to do this an hour earlier and had not bothered to prepare anything more substantial, true, in its own accidental way, to everything I'd come to understand about Chad's relationship to effort. Vanessa's toast came next, longer, more polished, full of specific, warm anecdotes about Mom's incredible strength since Dad passed, that I listened to with an interested, almost academic detachment, noting how easily entitlement could produce, on demand, a performance of gratitude that cost the performer nothing real. Then Diane rose, to genuine warm applause from the room, and gave a 7-minute speech about legacy, about Walter's original dump truck, about the next generation carrying this family forward, gesturing, at the climax of the speech, directly toward Bradley, seated beside me, and said the sentence that I have replayed in my mind more times than almost any other sentence spoken to me in my entire life. And I couldn't be prouder of my son, who I know is going to lead this company into its next 66 years with the same integrity his father built it with. The room applauded. Bradley smiled and raised his glass. I sat perfectly still, my own glass untouched on the table in front of me, and felt for the first time all evening something that was not quite triumph and not quite grief, but some third, unnamed emotion sitting exactly between them, watching a woman toast her son's integrity 4 minutes before 2 federal agents would demonstrate, in front of 400 witnesses, precisely how much of that integrity was fictional. At 8:34, as the applause for Diane's toast was still settling and waitstaff were beginning to clear the salad course, Agent Tom Reyes rose from his seat near the west entrance and began walking, unhurried, entirely without drama, directly toward the head table, with Agent Carla Diaz falling into step from the opposite direction at almost the exact same moment, the two of them converging on Bradley Marsh's chair with the kind of calm, practiced coordination that made the room go quiet in stages, table by table, as people noticed something was happening before they understood what. Agent Reyes stopped directly beside Bradley's chair, close enough that I could see Bradley's hand, resting on the white tablecloth, go completely still, and said, in a voice pitched to carry clearly but without any theatrical volume, "Bradley Thomas Marsh, I'm Special Agent Tom Reyes with the FBI. I have a warrant for your arrest on federal charges of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud." The room did not gasp, exactly, not immediately. It did something stranger, a kind of collective inhale that seemed to suck all the sound out of that gilded ceiling for 2 or 3 full seconds before 400 separate conversations erupted at once. A wave of noise and half-risen bodies and craning necks that Agent Diaz cut through by raising one hand, calm, authoritative, saying clearly, "Please remain seated. This will only take a moment. There's no danger to anyone in this room." Bradley stood because Agent Reyes had a hand lightly on his elbow guiding him up, and his face, under the chandelier, had gone the exact gray-white color I'd seen once before in a hotel lobby 11 weeks earlier, except now it was frozen there, permanently, in front of every person who mattered to the version of himself he had spent 40 years constructing. There was a brief, strange moment, in the half-second between Agent Reyes speaking Bradley's name and the room's collective inhale, when I caught my own reflection in a silver serving dish sitting on the table in front of me, distorted and small, and I remember thinking, with an odd, detached clarity, that the woman in that reflection looked exactly like she had every single day of the preceding 7 months. Calm, composed, entirely unremarkable to anyone who hadn't spent that time learning exactly what she was capable of building when finally given a reason to build it. Diane's reaction came a half-second later, and it is, I think, the single most honest thing I ever witnessed her do in 9 years of knowing her. She did not ask what was happening, did not demand an explanation, did not even look, at first, at the agents or at Bradley. She looked directly at me, across the table, her face contorting into something I had genuinely never seen on her before, raw and unguarded, and finally stripped of every layer of performed superiority she had worn, like armor for as long as I'd known her, and she said, her voice carrying further than she probably intended in the sudden quiet, "What did you do?" Not a question. An accusation, delivered with the specific fury of someone who has just understood, in real time, that the practical one she'd spent 9 years condescending to was in fact the single most dangerous person in that entire ballroom. I did not raise my voice. I did not stand up dramatically. I sat exactly where I was, in my dark green gown, my hands folded on the white tablecloth, and I said, loudly enough for the head table and the several nearby tables to hear clearly, in the same level deposition voice I had used with Bradley in our kitchen months earlier, "I documented it, Diane. All of it. 11 transfers through a shell company Bradley registered without either of your knowledge, apparently, or with it. That's actually still being determined. $41,000 to a hotel account for his affair with your marketing coordinator, who's sitting at table 14, by the way, in case anyone's wondering where Courtney is right now. $81,000 laundered to Vanessa and Chad's account for a kitchen renovation, disguised as a consulting fee for consulting work that never happened. And the company's operating accounts, and yours, personally, were frozen 49 minutes ago, which is why Harold has been sitting at his table since 7:45 looking like he's seen a ghost. I paused, and in that pause, I watched Vanessa's face go through the same collapse Bradley's had, watched Chad's mouth actually fall open, watched, 3 tables back, Courtney Blaze stand up halfway from her chair with a look of pure, dawning horror as 200 heads turned to find her. And I finished. I built forensic fraud cases for a living for 10 years, Diane. I introduced myself to you a decade ago as someone who does something with numbers. You never once asked what. Agent Reyes, beside Bradley, allowed exactly that much before moving forward with procedure, guiding a now visibly shaking Bradley toward the west exit while reciting his rights in the flat. Practice cadence of a man who has done this hundreds of times, and the room, behind them, dissolved into a chaos I can only describe in fragments, because I was no longer, in that moment, tracking the whole scene with forensic precision. I was simply living inside it. Diane, on her feet now, was shouting something at Harold Trask about fixing this immediately, her voice cracking in a way I had never heard in 9 years of her carefully controlled public register. Franklin Ashworth, the bank board member, was already on his phone, walking briskly toward the exit, and I understood, watching him go, that whatever remained of Marsh & Son's credit relationship with that bank had likely just ended in real time, in front of him, in the worst possible way for the company's future. Vanessa had grabbed Chad's arm and was hissing something at him I couldn't hear, and Courtney Blaze, at table 14, had simply frozen, standing halfway up, her hand pressed over her mouth, while the marketing director beside her, who I happened to know had no idea about any of this either, stared at her with an expression shifting rapidly from confusion to comprehension to something like disgust. Franklin Ashworth, I should tell you, did not simply leave quietly. I learned later, through Margot, who'd heard it secondhand from someone on the bank's side who'd been at the event, that he'd stopped at the west entrance long enough to say something to a colleague that made its way back to us almost verbatim. I've sat across from that woman in 3 board meetings this year, and something about the numbers never sat right with me. Should have trusted it. I think about that sentence often because it captures something essential about what Diane's entire performance had been built to prevent. The moment when someone with actual institutional power stopped extending the family the benefit of the doubt their charm had always previously purchased for them. Near the coat check, 20 minutes after Bradley was let out, I found myself standing, unexpectedly, next to Courtney Blaze, both of us waiting for our coats in a line that had slowed to a crawl as event staff, servers, and confused guests all tried to process what had just happened around them. She was crying, quietly, not performatively, the specific stunned crying of someone whose entire understanding of the last year and a half of her life had just been rewritten in front of 400 strangers. And she looked at me, mascara running, and said, in a small voice I almost didn't recognize as the same confident young woman who'd told me weeks earlier that family's family. Did you know? This whole time, did you know about everything? I looked at her for a long moment, and I thought about every cruel thing I could have said. Every version of the truth designed purely to wound rather than inform, and I chose, instead, the plainest one. I found out in April, I said. I've been building the case since then. It was never about you specifically, Courtney. It was about the money, and it was about the truth. She nodded, wiping her face with the back of one hand, and said nothing else. And we stood there, the wife and the mistress, waiting for our coats in a marble lobby that 130 years earlier had processed actual currency, saying nothing further to each other, because there was, by that point, genuinely nothing left that needed saying. I gave one brief statement to a reporter that night, a young woman from a local Westchester outlet who'd apparently been tipped off by someone in the room within minutes and had rushed over from a nearby assignment, and I want to include exactly what I said because it's close to the 4 sentences I'd written and deleted 100 times that final week. My name is Elena Voss Marsh. I'm a forensic accountant, and for the last 7 months, I've documented in full the diversion of company and household funds by my husband, Bradley Marsh, in cooperation with federal investigators. I have no further comment on the pending criminal matter, but I will say this. The truth doesn't require anyone's permission to exist. It just requires someone willing to write it down. The reporter looked slightly stunned that I'd given her anything usable at all, scribbling quickly, and I turned and walked toward the coat check, past Diane, who was still standing near the head table, surrounded now by Harold Trask and two other family attorneys who'd apparently been summoned by phone within minutes, her silver gown catching the chandelier light in a way that, hours earlier, would have looked triumphant, and now simply looked like a woman standing in the wreckage of a story she'd told for so long she'd forgotten, somewhere along the way, that it needed to be true. I stayed seated at that head table for almost 11 full minutes after Bradley was led out through the west doors, past 400 guests who had stopped even pretending to eat, watching the entire architecture of a family's performed legacy collapse in real time under a chandelier that had, 130 years earlier, hung over an actual functioning bank, and I felt, sitting there in the wreckage of noise and shouted recriminations and Diane's voice rising and cracking somewhere behind me, something I had not expected to feel at all, which was a strange, settling quiet, almost like the moment after a long court proceeding finally reaches a verdict. Not joy, exactly, and not vindication in the loud, satisfying way movies portray it, but something quieter and more permanent. The specific, bone-deep relief of a case, finally, conclusively, closed. It's been 11 months now since that night at the Whalen, and I want to tell you in order exactly what happened to each of them, because I think you've earned the specifics. The same way I've spent this entire story earning my own conclusions through specifics rather than assumptions. Bradley pled guilty, in the end, to 2 counts of wire fraud in a plea agreement Devin Okafor's office negotiated in April, after his attorney, a passive white-collar defense lawyer Diane had hired, using funds that the forfeiture action had, fortunately not fully reached, spent 4 months trying and failing to construct a defense around the idea that Bradley had reasonably believed the transfers were sanctioned family business expenses. A defense that collapsed almost immediately once Priya Anand's documentation of the deliberately structured, just under threshold expense approvals was entered into the record, because you cannot, credibly, argue you reasonably believed something was authorized when the paper trail shows you specifically engineering each transaction to avoid the exact review process that would have caught it. He was sentenced in June to 26 months in a federal facility in Pennsylvania, plus restitution of $163,000 to Marsh & Sons Construction and Development, a company that, by the time restitution was ordered, technically no longer existed in any form that could meaningfully collect it, because it had, by then, been formally dissolved. I did not attend the sentencing. Margot advised against it, on the grounds that my presence would serve no legal purpose and could complicate the emotional narrative for a case that was, by that point, entirely resolved on the facts. And I found, when I actually sat with the decision, that I had no real desire to be there anyway. I read about it 2 days later in a brief item in the local Westchester paper and felt, reading it, mostly a kind of clean, distant confirmation. The way you feel reading the final line of an audit report you already knew the conclusion to. I want to describe that March deposition more fully, because it was the last time I saw Diane Marsh in person, and it deserves more than the passing mention I gave it. It took place in a conference room on the 11th floor of a Manhattan law firm, Diane on one side of the table with her civil litigation attorney, a sharp, tired-looking man named Gerald Feinstein, and Margot and I on the other, along with a court reporter transcribing every word into a record I still, occasionally, request a copy of just to remind myself the day was real. Diane wore navy instead of her usual silver or cream, a small, telling detail I noticed immediately, the kind of instinctive costume choice a woman makes when she understands, on some level, that this is not an occasion for looking triumphant. Gerald Feinstein spent most of the deposition instructing her not to answer questions related to specific knowledge of the fraudulent transfers, invoking her Fifth Amendment protections repeatedly given the ongoing related criminal exposure risk, a legal maneuver that told me, more clearly than any direct answer could have, exactly how much Diane's own attorney believed she actually knew. But there was one moment near the end of a 4-hour session when Margot asked a narrower, more specific question, not about the transfers themselves, but about the internal controls framework I had built for the company 3 years earlier, whether Diane recalled receiving it, whether she recalled the reasons she'd given for not implementing it, and Gerald Feinstein, perhaps calculating that this particular question carried less criminal exposure than the others, allowed her to answer. Diane looked at the table for a long moment, and then, in a voice smaller than I had ever heard her use in 9 years of knowing her, said, "I remember it. I told her we didn't need it because we were family." She did not look at me when she said it. She looked at her own hands, folded on the table in front of her, And I understood, watching her in that moment, that some part of Diane Marsh had already conducted her own private audit of that decision, alone, probably many times, in the two-bedroom rental condominium she now lived in, and had arrived, finally, too late to matter to anyone but herself, at the correct verdict. Diane was never criminally charged in the end. The evidentiary threshold for proving she had actual, provable knowledge of the specific fraudulent transactions, rather than a generalized, willful blindness to her son's financial conduct, was never quite met to the standard federal prosecutors required, a fact that still sits uncomfortably with me some days, though Margot has reminded me, more than once, that the civil consequences landed with their own considerable force. The civil forfeiture action seized the remaining balance of Walter's life insurance principal that Diane had drawn against, which turned out, once Priya Anand's forensic tracing was complete, to have been reduced to just under $400,000 from an original $2.3 million, meaning that over the preceding 6 years, well before Bradley's specific fraud even began, Diane had been drawing down the company's supposed insulation at a rate that had nothing to do with growth and everything to do with maintaining an appearance of stability the business had not actually possessed in years. Marsh & Sons Construction and Development, stripped of its credit line after Franklin Ashworth's bank formally withdrew its facility in January, unable to secure alternative financing given the pending federal case, and unable to complete its 3 active developments without that financing. Filed for Chapter 7 liquidation in March, laying off all 41 employees, a fact that I think about more than almost anything else in this entire story, because those 41 families had nothing to do with the Marsh family's private dysfunction and everything to lose from it. Diane sold the house in Rye in May, moved into a 2-bedroom rental condominium in White Plains that a woman I once watched correct a wine steward's pronunciation now describes, according to Vanessa, who still occasionally texts me updates I did not ask for, as cozy, very manageable. I saw Diane exactly once since the gala, at a deposition in March related to the civil matter, where she looked, for the first time in 9 years, genuinely, visibly older than her age, and where she said nothing to me at all beyond what her attorney had clearly instructed, though she held my gaze, once, across the conference table, for a long moment that contained, I think, something closer to actual comprehension than anything she'd offered me in the preceding decade. Bradley wrote me 3 letters after that visit, over the following 2 months, forwarded through his attorney per the terms Margot had insisted on to keep any correspondence documented and appropriately filtered. And I want to tell you about the 3rd one specifically, because it was the only one that felt, to me, like it came from somewhere honest, rather than from panic or self-pity. In it, Bradley wrote about a conversation he'd had, in the facility, with another inmate serving time for a similar white-collar case. A man who'd apparently told him, bluntly, the people who love you the most are usually the easiest people to lie to, because they want to believe you, and wanting to believe someone is the whole game. Bradley wrote that he'd thought about that sentence for 3 days straight, turning it over, and had finally understood, he said, that he'd spent our entire marriage exploiting exactly that dynamic without ever consciously deciding to, simply drifting into it because it was easier than the alternative of actually earning, every day, the trust I extended to him automatically. I don't know if that letter represented real growth or simply the particular performative self-awareness that facilities like his seem to produce in inmates working toward a parole hearing. I wrote back once, a short reply, the only one I sent, saying only that I hoped the reflection was genuine, for his own sake going forward, and that I wished him a life, eventually, built on something more solid than performance. I have not heard from him since, and I don't expect to, and I've made a specific, deliberate peace with that silence. Not everyone who wrongs you owes you a resolution, and I no longer need one from Bradley Marsh to consider my own account of that marriage complete. I visited Bradley exactly once, in August, before his sentencing, not out of any lingering affection, but because Dr. Kessler had suggested, gently, that I might need the closure of one final, unmediated conversation, without lawyers, without documents, without an audience, before the legal process fully concluded and took the decision about closure out of my hands entirely. The federal detention facility where he was being held pending sentencing was a squat, beige building in Lower Manhattan, and I sat across from him in a visiting room with fluorescent lighting and a scarred plastic table, and Bradley, thinner than I'd ever seen him, his usual easy charm entirely absent, replaced by something raw and frightened that I almost felt sorry for, said, "I don't understand how you could do this to me. I loved you." I sat with that sentence for a long moment because it was, in its own way, the most honest thing Bradley Marsh had said to me in years, and also the most revealing, Because even facing 26 months in federal prison, even having been caught engineering 9 months of deliberate financial fraud and a parallel affair, Bradley's operating framework still centered entirely on what had been done to him, rather than what he had done. "You didn't do anything to lose, Bradley," I said. "You did something to me, to Marsh & Sons, to 41 employees who lost their jobs because you couldn't be honest about wanting more than you'd earned. I didn't do this to you. I just finally wrote down what you'd already done." He didn't have a response to that. I left 20 minutes later, and I remember standing outside that beige building in the August heat, waiting for a car, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel at all. Not triumph, not grief, but a kind of quiet, exhausted completeness. The specific feeling of having said the one true thing you needed to say to someone, regardless of whether they were capable of actually hearing it. Vanessa and Chad's situation unraveled with a speed that almost surprised me, given how little either of them had ever demonstrated in the way of financial resilience. The $81,000 they'd received, once identified conclusively as proceeds of fraud, became subject to a separate civil disgorgement action, and while they were fortunate, genuinely fortunate, in a way Bradley was not, to avoid criminal exposure themselves, since prosecutors determined Vanessa's knowledge, while almost certainly real on some level, was not provable to a criminal standard either, they were ordered to repay the full amount, a sum they did not have liquid, forcing them to sell the Catskills property within the year, at what Vanessa's own realtor apparently described, in an email that somehow found its way to me through a mutual acquaintance, as a rushed, below-market sale. Chad remarkably finally got a job in September, not in commercial real estate, but as an assistant manager at a sporting goods store in White Plains, a position Vanessa reportedly told her remaining friend group was just temporary, obviously, while he figures out his next big move. A sentence that made me laugh out loud, alone in my apartment for the first time in months, because some patterns, I've come to believe, do not actually break, they just relocate to smaller rooms. I think about the 41 employees more than I think about almost anyone in the Marsh family itself, and I want to give them more than a passing mention, because they are, in the truest accounting of harm in this entire story, the people who suffered the most severe and least deserved consequences of Bradley's fraud and Diane's willful blindness. Priya and I, once the case had concluded, spent an afternoon we didn't need to spend, professionally speaking, simply looking up what had happened to some of them. A foreman named Ray Delgado who'd worked at Marsh & Sons for 19 years, since before Bradley had even joined the company, who found a new position within 3 months at a competing firm, but at $11 an hour less than he'd been earning. An office manager named Sheila Ostrowski, who'd been 6 years from a full pension vestiture and lost the company match entirely when the Chapter 7 filing wiped out the retirement plan's employer contributions. A young project engineer, only 2 years out of college, who told a local reporter, in a quote that struck me harder than almost anything Diane or Bradley ever said to me directly, that he'd believed in the company's story, the whole legacy thing, and it turns out none of us actually knew what we were working for. I did not build this case to protect those 41 people specifically. I built it to establish the truth of my own life. But I think about them often, and I've made a point, in the months since, of writing character references for 3 of them, who reached out to me directly for new job applications. A small, insufficient gesture that nonetheless felt like the only meaningful thing I could actually do to address a harm I hadn't caused but had, in exposing the fraud, ultimately accelerated. Courtney Blaze, I learned through the same unfortunate grapevine of mutual acquaintances that seems determined to keep me informed of a family I no longer belong to, left New York entirely within 2 months of the gala, moving back to her hometown somewhere in Ohio. Her LinkedIn profile, which I checked exactly once, out of a curiosity I'm not proud of but won't pretend I didn't have, now listing a marketing coordinator role at a regional insurance company, no mention anywhere of Marsh & Sons construction and development. I don't know what she understood about her own position in this story, whether she ever fully grasped that she had been, from the beginning, less a great romance and more a convenient, opportunistic landing place for a man who needed somewhere to feel important that his own wife's competence hadn't already occupied. I don't think about her often. When I do, it's with something closer to the specific, professional pity I feel for the smaller players in every fraud case I've ever worked. Not architects of the scheme, just people who found an open door and walked through it, and are now standing, blinking, in a hallway they didn't build and can't quite explain. The divorce settlement itself deserves its own accounting, because Margot fought for something more unusual than a simple asset split, and it took 4 months of negotiation to get there. Under New York's equitable distribution framework, marital assets are generally divided based on contribution, need, and duration. But proving disproportionate contribution requires documentation most divorcing spouses never think to keep, which meant that the very same forensic discipline I'd applied to building the federal case against Bradley became, almost as a byproduct, the foundation of my own divorce filing. Margot submitted as exhibits 9 years of my own income statements alongside 9 years of joint household spending, the wedding invoice, the graduate school loan payoff records, 4 documented loans to Vanessa that were never repaid and had never been treated as marital debt on any joint filing, and the full forensic accounting of Marsh Family Holdings LLC, arguing that Bradley's fraudulent diversion of funds constituted marital waste under New York law, a legal theory that entitles the non-wasting spouse to a larger share of remaining marital assets, specifically to offset dissipated funds. Bradley's attorney, facing both a pending federal indictment and an airtight civil paper trail, folded within 6 weeks of the first settlement conference, and the final agreement awarded me 85% of the remaining marital estate, a percentage Margot told me, with something close to professional satisfaction she had maybe achieved twice before in 28 years of practice, and never this cleanly. I want to be honest that the money itself was never really the point, even though I recognize how strange that might sound coming from someone who spent the better part of a year building a case measured in exact dollar amounts. The point for me was narrower and stranger than money. I needed a legal document signed by a judge that stated, in explicit, unambiguous language, that I had been the one who built the life we shared, and that the ending of that life would reflect who had actually built it. There is a particular kind of peace that comes from having your own reality validated by an institution with no emotional stake in protecting anyone's feelings, and I felt that peace, distinctly, the afternoon Margot called to tell me the settlement was finalized. Not joy, not relief exactly, but something closer to the quiet, settling satisfaction of watching a ledger, kept honestly for years by only one party, finally balance. I've started dating again, slowly, over the last 4 months, mostly because a friend from graduate school insisted, with the specific bullying affection only old friends can get away with, that I was not allowed to become a cautionary tale who never trusts anyone again. I've been on 11 dates with 6 different people, a fact I know precisely because some habits, apparently, do not disappear even in matters of the heart. And I've noticed something about myself in the process that I find quietly encouraging. I ask harder questions now, earlier, about money, about family dynamics, about how a person talks about their own parents and siblings, and I no longer feel even a flicker of guilt about asking them. One man, on a second date in September, mentioned offhand that his brother had asked to borrow money a few times over the years, and I watched myself, almost involuntarily, ask 3 clarifying follow-up questions about repayment terms and family expectations before I caught myself and laughed out loud at my own reflexes, and he laughed too, and said, "You really are exactly what your reputation says you are, aren't you?" Having apparently read the same news coverage everyone else in my general orbit had read by that point. I did not find that observation insulting. I found it, for the first time in longer than I can remember, like being finally fully seen for something true. As for me, Hollis Denby Group made me a full equity partner in February. Largely, my managing partner told me with a dry half-smile I'll never forget. Because apparently you've been quietly running the most thorough forensic investigation any of us have ever seen, on your own personal time, for free, and it seems like a waste not to actually pay you for that skill set going forward. I sold the Bronxville house in May for $430,000 more than we'd paid for it 9 years earlier, and used the proceeds along with the settlement Margot negotiated in the divorce that finalized quietly in July, a settlement that recognized, in explicit dollar terms for the very first time in 9 years, the actual disproportionate financial contribution I had made to that marriage every single year of it, to buy a co-op on the Upper West Side with a view of the park instead of another glass tower's blank reflection, and to start, finally, at 35 years old, a life that belongs entirely and only to me. I still talk to Margot every few weeks, not about cases anymore, mostly, just about life, which I think surprised us both, that the working relationship became something closer to real friendship once the working part concluded. I talked to my father more than I used to, too. He read every filing in the civil case, because of course he did, and told me, on the phone the week after the sentencing, in the closest thing to open emotion I've ever heard from Richard Voss in 34 years of knowing him, I built cases for 31 years, Elena, and I never built one that clean. I'm proud of you, and I sat with the phone against my ear in my new apartment, looking out at a park I now owned a small, permanent slice of a view of, and let myself, for once, simply accept a compliment instead of immediately auditing it for accuracy. I should tell you about the 6 weeks immediately after the gala, too, because the story doesn't actually end cleanly at the moment of arrest, however satisfying that moment was to live through. Real consequences take months to actually land, and I spent a good portion of that January and February doing something I hadn't anticipated needing to do at all, managing my own life in the aftermath of having become, briefly, a minor local news story. The Westchester Outlet ran the piece 2 days after the gala, and it was picked up, within a week, by 2 larger regional papers and 1 national business publication that specialized in white-collar fraud coverage, running a piece titled, to my mild embarrassment, "The Forensic Accountant Who Took Down Her Own Husband's Family Business." A headline I found simultaneously accurate and reductive, the way I imagine most people feel reading a headline about the worst and most defining year of their life condensed into 11 words. I got calls from 2 true crime podcast producers, both of which I declined, on Margot's advice and, honestly, on my own instinct, because I had built this case to establish the truth in a court of law, not to build a personal brand out of my own husband's downfall. The professional fallout at Hollis Denby Group went the opposite direction from what I'd braced for. I had genuinely worried, in the weeks after the story broke, that having my personal life so publicly entangled with a federal fraud case might make clients uncomfortable, might make partners quietly wonder whether I was now too close to scandal to be trusted with sensitive engagements. Instead, within a month, I had 3 new client referrals, specifically because prospective clients had read about the case and wanted, in the words of one general counsel who called our managing partner directly, the person who found her own husband's shell company in 11 minutes on a subway car. There is something almost darkly funny about the fact that the worst thing that ever happened to me became, professionally, the single best piece of unpaid marketing of my entire career. And I've made my peace with that irony slowly, over months, the same way I've made my peace with most of what happened that year. Not by deciding it was worth it, exactly, because I don't think I'll ever describe losing a marriage and an extended family as worth it, but by deciding that meaning and cost are not the same measurement, and a year can be simultaneously the worst of your life and the one that finally taught you your own actual value. The professional fallout at Hollis Denby Group went the opposite direction from what I'd braced for. I had genuinely worried, in the weeks after the story broke, that having my personal life so publicly entangled with a federal fraud case might make clients uncomfortable, might make partners quietly wonder whether I was now too close to scandal to be trusted with sensitive engagements. Instead, within a month, I had 3 new client referrals, specifically because prospective clients had read about the case and wanted, in the words of one general counsel who called our managing partner directly, the person who found her own husband's shell company in 11 minutes on a subway car. There is something almost darkly funny about the fact that the worst thing that ever happened to me became, professionally, the single best piece of unpaid marketing of my entire career. And I've made my peace with that irony slowly, over months, the same way I've made my peace with most of what happened that year, not by deciding it was worth it. Exactly, because I don't think I'll ever describe losing a marriage and an extended family as worth it, but by deciding that meaning and cost are not the same measurement, and a year can be simultaneously the worst of your life and the one that finally taught you your own actual value. One of those 3 new clients deserves a specific mention, because the case itself felt, working it, like an almost eerie echo of my own life laid over someone else's details. A woman named Renata Kessler Vance, 42, a partner at a management consulting firm, came to Hollis Denby in February suspecting her husband, who ran his own small logistics company, of diverting funds to support what she described, carefully, as a lifestyle that doesn't match his income. I recognized the shape of it before she'd finished her first sentence. The shell entity, the joint account she'd been asked to not worry about. The family members who'd received unexplained transfers she'd been too exhausted or too trusting to question. I built her case in 11 weeks instead of the 7 months it had taken me to build my own, not because her husband's fraud was simpler, but because I now knew, with hard-won precision, exactly which threads to pull first. When the case resolved, with a clean asset preservation order and a subsequent criminal referral, Renata sent me a note that I still keep in my desk drawer at the office. "You didn't just find my husband's money. You gave me permission to stop doubting what I already knew." I think about that note often because it captures something I didn't fully understand about my own case until I'd helped someone else through theirs. The forensic work is never really about the money, in the end. It's about restoring a person's confidence in their own perception, after months or years of being told, implicitly or explicitly, that what they were seeing wasn't real. I started therapy in January, for the first time in my adult life, with a psychologist named Dr. Ann Kessler, who specializes, somewhat improbably, in financial infidelity and its psychological aftermath, a niche I did not know existed until Margot, of all people, recommended her, saying only, "Everyone I've ever represented through something like this needed somewhere to put the parts of the story that don't belong in a legal filing." Dr. Kessler and I spent the first several sessions simply establishing what she called my baseline, and I remember her asking me, in our third session, why I thought I had structured 9 years of marriage around quietly absorbing financial and emotional costs without ever demanding reciprocity, and I gave her the honest answer, the one I'd never said out loud to anyone before, including myself. I had grown up watching my father catch other people's frauds for a living, watching him come home exhausted from proving, over and over, that people who seemed trustworthy on paper had been lying the entire time. And some part of me, I think, had spent my whole adult life terrified of ever becoming, myself, someone whose trust in another person turned out to be professionally naive. Marrying Bradley, loving him uncritically for years, refusing to apply my own professional scrutiny to my own marriage, had been, in some strange way, an act of rebellion against my own upbringing, a determined, willful insistence that I could simply choose to trust someone completely, the way ordinary people did, without needing to verify it the way my father had spent his whole career verifying everyone else's claims. Dr. Kessler let that sit in the room for a long moment before she said, gently, "And what did that cost you?" I didn't have an answer that day. I have one now, 11 months later, and it's simply this. It cost me 9 years of not fully being myself, in exchange for the temporary comfort of believing I didn't have to be. I want to tell you about one more relationship that changed, quietly, in the aftermath, because it surprised me more than almost anything else in this story. My relationship with my own mother. She had never liked Bradley, something she'd never said outright in 9 years beyond small, coded comments. "He's certainly charming, isn't he?" delivered in a tone that, in hindsight, carried an entire unspoken paragraph, because she'd learned decades earlier, married to my father, that certain kinds of charm exist specifically to distract from an absence of substance underneath. When I finally told her everything in a long phone call in January, she was quiet for a long time, and then she said something that undid me more than almost anything else anyone said that entire year. "I used to worry, Elena, that you'd spend your whole life being so good at catching everyone else's lies that you'd forget to ever ask yourself whether you were living inside one of your own. I'm glad you finally asked. We talk every week now, longer calls than we ever used to have, and I think, in some strange, backward way, that untangling my own marriage's fraud has also untangled something in my relationship with my own family of origin. A closeness I don't think either of us knew we'd been missing until the crisis forced us to actually reach for it." By March, the co-op search had begun in earnest, and I want to tell you about the specific apartment I almost bought instead of the one I ultimately chose, because the choice itself feels like the clearest possible symbol of who I'd become by the end of this story. The first apartment, a beautifully renovated 2-bedroom in a doorman building near Lincoln Center, was objectively the better investment. Better light, better layout, a stronger resale trajectory, according to the broker's own analysis, which I'd insisted on seeing in full, because old habits by that point had become simply habits. But it had, in the primary bedroom, a built-in bar area with a wine fridge, a small architectural detail that stopped me cold the first time I saw it, because it was almost identical, down to the finish of the cabinetry, to the bar area Bradley and I had installed in the Bronxville house in our 5th year of marriage, a renovation project I'd funded entirely and that Bradley had, at the time, taken full credit for at a dinner party, telling guests he'd designed the whole thing himself. I stood in that Lincoln Center apartment, staring at a wine fridge that had nothing to do with my actual marriage, and felt my chest tighten anyway, and I told the broker, same afternoon, that I needed to see other options. The apartment I ultimately bought, the one with the park view, had no bar area at all, just a simple, quiet reading nook by the window where I now keep. Of all things, that laminated poster board timeline Priya gave me, framed properly now, hung not as a trophy exactly, but as a reminder, the way some people keep a marathon bib or a diploma. Proof, on the days I need it, that I once built something extraordinarily difficult entirely with my own hands, under conditions almost no one should ever have to build anything under. Here's what I've come to understand. 11 months out, turning this whole story over the way I once turned over ledgers looking for the one number that didn't reconcile. Every family, every marriage, every institution runs on a story it tells about itself. And most of the time, most people never have to find out how much of that story was ever actually true, because no one ever bothers to check the math. I checked the math. I checked it because checking the math is what I do, professionally, and because, underneath 9 years of being called practical, like it was a limitation instead of a discipline, I had simply never stopped being the person who needed the numbers to actually add up. I lost a marriage. I lost, in some real sense, an entire extended family I had genuinely loved, badly as they'd earned it. But I kept the one thing none of them had ever actually understood I possessed the whole time. The thing Diane introduced at every party for 9 years as though it were incidental. I kept my own accounting of the truth, complete, documented, and, in the end, entirely mine to use. So here's my question for you. Watching this from wherever you're watching it, on whatever train or couch or break room you've carved 30 minutes out of your day to sit with a stranger's worst year, how long would you let a lie run, in your own life, before you finally opened the file and started counting? There's one more thing I never told Margot, never told Dr. Kessler, never told my own father. A detail Priya found buried in the very last batch of records that came back from the bank 3 weeks after the gala, after the case had already resolved, after I thought every number had already been accounted for. A 12th transfer, one I hadn't known about. 4 days before the wedding date we would have celebrated this December, routed to an account that wasn't Marsh Family Holdings LLC at all, wasn't Vanessa's, wasn't Courtney's, a name I didn't recognize, in a city I'd never heard Bradley mention once in 9 years of marriage, for an amount that made Priya call me at 11 at night, her voice tight in a way I'd never heard from her, saying only, "Elena, you need to see this before you decide this story is actually over." You already sat through the ending you thought this was. Comment 12th if you want to know what came after it. Subscribe if you've made it this far, because you already know exactly the kind of person who finishes what she starts, and so do I.